Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through time into the living, breathing silence of ancient Rome, one not carved in triumphal arches, nor echoed in the clamor of the Colosseum, but one that lingers quietly between marble and blood. As you settle in for a restorative sleep or a moment of calm, I invite your mind to drift into the winding backstreets of an empire that still stirs beneath layers of dust and myth. Not the Rome of emperors or epic battles, but the Rome of shadows, of heavy breaths behind closed doors, of tired footsteps echoing on stone before dawn. Before we begin our story, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. Feel free to leave a comment and share. It's always a joy to see our global community gathering for these gentle historical journeys. And if you resonate with this soft and immersive style of storytelling, a quiet click on the subscribe button would be much appreciated. It's thoughtful listeners like you who keep this series of historical tales flowing smoothly. Let the world outside soften now. Perhaps the lights around you are dimmed, or perhaps you lie in the dark, only the glow of a screen faintly flickering in the distance. You may feel the weight of the day still lingering in your limbs, the gentle ache in your shoulders, the dull tension behind your eyes, or that quiet hum of restlessness in the back of your mind. That's okay. This space is made for all of that. This story is made for you. Close your eyes if you'd like, or simply let your gaze drift. The story doesn't need your full attention. It only asks for your presence. And now, imagine a street in ancient Rome, long before the world awakes. The air is still, not silent, but holding its breath. The stars above are beginning to fade behind a veil of smoke from dying torches and faint cooking fires. Somewhere a dog barks once, and the sound ricochets between rows of tall, narrow buildings made of stone and wood. The walls are dark with soot. The doorways are closed. There is no wind, only the scent of oil, of iron, of damp stone still cooling from yesterday's heat. You step softly. The ground beneath your feet is uneven, cobblestone slick with refuse, stray straw, and the dark stains of things no one has bothered to clean. There is a bitter smell in the air, not quite rot, but close. Human waste, maybe, or sour wine spilled in haste. Somewhere nearby, someone coughs into the silence, a deep, chest-rattling sound, and then nothing, just the creaking of wooden beams overhead and the slow exhale of the city. This is not the Rome we learn about in school books. This is not the marble vision of glory etched into monuments or frozen in museum halls. This Rome is soft around the edges, decaying and alive. It breathes with the heat of human bodies packed into tenements, with the sweat of men lifting amphorae at dawn, with the quiet sorrow of women washing bloodied linens before sunrise. It pulses beneath the gold, a heartbeat of aching backs and empty stomachs, of rituals performed not for splendor but for survival, and you are not standing in the forum. You are not part of the Senate or the stage. You are in the alleys, behind the bakeries, above the stables, with the people who history forgot. You might be a servant, rising before the sun to prepare bread for someone else's breakfast, or a child barely clothed, blinking into the morning light with no memory of safety. You might be old or young or neither. You might be sick. You might be afraid. You might be tired in ways no sleep can cure. And yet you move forward, like they did. The empire, at its height, was vast beyond comprehension. It ruled over continents, dictated currencies, and shaped laws that echo to this day. But here, in this story, we are not tracing the rise and fall of power. We are not celebrating conquest. We are listening for the sounds that were never carved into stone, the weary sigh, the whispered prayer, the scream stifled behind a closed door, the silence that followed. This is a story about bodies, about how they endured, how they ached and bled and yearned. It is about lives lived in the margins of greatness, about mornings that began not with declarations, but with the scrape of a wooden door, the clang of a ladle against a pot, the rustle of sandals over dust. It is about how Rome smelled, how it felt, how it held people in its arms, and sometimes how it crushed them. The people we'll meet tonight did not write history, but they lived it, through sickness, through hunger, through unbearable heat and biting cold, through rituals passed down with trembling hands, through love that never found words, through grief that had no space to speak itself aloud. Their pain may feel strangely familiar, their exhaustion, their quiet resilience, their fear of what comes after the fire dies out and the world grows dark. And perhaps as you lie here, still now, you'll recognize something of yourself in them, in their restlessness, in their quiet, in their need to be seen, even if just for a moment, by someone who will not look away. So let us not look away. Tonight, we will walk slowly, tenderly. We will drift through the folds of time not as scholars or judges, but as witnesses, gentle witnesses. We will sit by the hearths where children once cried. We will linger by the fountains where widows whispered their grief. We will climb the creaking stairs of buildings long gone and feel the heat of crowded rooms thick with sweat, incense, and smoke. And when we are done, hours from now, when the story has wound its way gently through all the shadows and silences, we will return, changed perhaps, or simply softened. So stay with me if you can. Breathe slower. Let the noise inside you quiet. Let the questions fade. The city is waiting, not the city of monuments, but the city of the forgotten. The city of the tired, the silenced, the unseen. We begin now, in the Rome that still lives behind the marble, the Rome of blood, breath, and silence. Before the city begins to stir, in the final hour of stillness before dawn, there is a quiet hum beneath the stone foundations of Rome. Not the hum of voices or footsteps, not yet, but something deeper. It is the breath of a living city, heavy and slow, steeped in heat, and the scent of things that linger long after they're forgotten. And in this breath, in this slow exhalation of marble and dust, you can already smell it. A stench, faint at first but ancient, familiar in the way that rot is familiar to the earth. It comes from the cracks in the pavement, from beneath the thresholds of doorways carved with God's names. It curls up through the stones of the bathhouses, through the grates set into lavish villa floors, through the alleyways behind bakeries, and the courtyards of senators. It is the smell of human life, its waste, its heat, its decay, refusing to disappear. We often imagine ancient Rome as a city of order and beauty. We think of white columns gleaming in the sun, of mosaics sparkling with colored glass, of villas arranged with perfect symmetry. We imagine its elite draped in silks, perfumed with rosewater, reclining on couches and sipping from goblets of wine while discussing matters of the Republic. And yet, beneath those very couches, just beyond the edges of those careful mosaics, sewage seeped into the stone. Even the most opulent homes were not spared. The Romans, to their credit, were brilliant engineers. They built the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer, as early as the 6th century BCE, one of the oldest drainage systems in the world. It was designed to carry rainwater, household waste, and runoff from the crowded streets into the Tiber River. It still exists in part to this day. And yet, for all its innovation, the system was not comprehensive. Most Roman homes, even those of the upper class, relied on more basic solutions. Latrines, often nothing more than stone benches with holes, were placed in corners of the house, sometimes in the kitchens, sometimes in open courtyards. Beneath them, ceramic pipes channeled waste outward, but not far enough. The smell stayed. It clung to the walls, crept beneath doors, mingled with the aromas of olive oil and musty wool. In the narrow insula where the poor lived, Communal toilets overflowed and urine was collected in jars, sometimes reused for washing clothes. And even in the wealthier domus, servants, many of them enslaved, had to manually empty cesspits. Buckets of excrement were dumped into public channels, or worse, tossed into the streets during the night. It was not uncommon to be walking home after sunset and feel something splash at your feet, warm, wet, and reeking, spilled from an upper window. There were no apologies. The street itself was layered in filth. Horse dung, spoiled grain, fish guts from the morning market, ash from nearby hearths, rotting leaves, and the fluids of the sick. These things baked under the Mediterranean sun, releasing their perfume into the air like a curse. And through it all, the Romans walked. They lifted the hems of their tunics. They turned their faces. They kept moving. To live in Rome was to live among smells. It was expected. And strangely, it was accepted. There was no shame in it, not for those born into it, not even for those who could afford to ignore it. In fact, some Romans believed that the gods were indifferent to human odor, that virtue could reside in a man who stank, and corruption in a man who bathed daily in cinnamon-scented oils. Cleanliness, as we understand it today, was not the dividing line between dignity and disgrace. It was the job of slaves to clean latrines, scrub floors, and maintain the appearance of hygiene. Their hands, soaked in wastewater and ashes, often bore the permanent burns of lime-based cleaning agents. They worked in silence, ignored by their masters, invisible in their servitude. In some households, the same water might be used to rinse dishes and douse the floors. In public, fountains provided water for all purposes, drinking, washing, even diluting urine for laundry, and yet they could never cleanse the whole city. Perfumes helped somewhat. Incense was burned in temples and homes alike. Strong, resinous smoke filled the air at religious ceremonies and private meals, not just to please the gods, but to mask the odor of life. Lavender sachets hung from doorways. Men rubbed scented oil onto their arms. Women combed their hair with rose-infused vinegar. But it was a losing battle. The truth was simpler. There was too much life packed into too little space. Over 1 million souls lived in the city of Rome at its height. Their breath, their sweat, their suffering, all of it pooled into the gutters. Even as senators debated law in the Curia and poets recited verses in candlelit salons, they too inhaled the same fetid air that drifted up from the stones. There was no escaping the fact that beneath every triumphal arch was a drain. Beneath every bath, a pipe. Beneath every mosaic of Neptune, a trickle of waste. And Rome's own greatness only made the contradiction more visible. The more the city grew, the more impossible it became to hide what lay beneath. Every new marble villa meant more waste, more runoff, more servants carrying buckets down stairwells. Every triumphal parade brought crowds who trampled refuse into the dirt. And in times of rain, when the sewers flooded, the city choked on itself. Rats ran openly through kitchens, fleas infested bedding, illness moved silently between districts, borne not by the gods but by filth. In this world, to breathe was to remember the body, to remember that no matter how high one's status, no matter how rich one's robes, or how heavy the gold ring on one's finger, one still lived in a place where rot was king, where the gods might overlook stench, but one's nose could not. So imagine now a noble woman rising from her bed at dawn, silk slipping from her shoulders. She crosses the mosaic floor with bare feet. She calls for warm water to be poured into her basin. She perfumes her wrists, paints her cheeks, combs her hair with a silver comb. And as she does beneath the tiles just below her, the household drain gurgles softly, carrying the waste of the evening before, some of it hers, out into the streets. This was Rome, a city of gold shadowed by its own sewage, a civilization of marvels scented with rot. And in the midst of it all, people lived, endured, and pretended not to notice the smell. In the shadows of the palaces and marble forums, in the apartments above the bakeries and behind the narrow stone walls of crowded alleys, lived the many who history seldom names. They were not slaves, yet they were far from free. They were the working poor of ancient Rome, artisans, porters, street sellers, laborers, those who rose with the first light, not for leisure, but for necessity. Their homes, called insulae, rose in layers above the chaos of the street. Thin wooden walls, sagging balconies, and narrow staircases marked these buildings, hastily built and dangerously flammable. On the uppermost floors, where the air was thinner and the rent cheaper, the rooms were smallest. There were no windows, only wooden shutters. The ceilings dripped with condensation in winter and blistered with heat in summer. It was here, just before the break of day, that life stirred with quiet dread. There was no breakfast in the Roman world as we know it. For the poor, the morning began with a cup of watered-down wine, or, if fortune allowed, a piece of bread left over from the night before, stiff, cold, and torn with the hands. The scent of charcoal fires being rekindled drifted through the cracks in the walls, mingling with the musty smell of old garments and the wet dust of unwashed floors. Clothes were simple, a tunic coarsely woven, worn again and again until it gave in at the seams. Feet were slipped into sandals or, if one had none, walked bare across the stone and filth of the streets. Hands were calloused. Fingernails, often blackened with soot or dirt, carried the residue of work that never truly ended. The day began early, before the heat made labor unbearable. Laborers gathered at forums or markets, hoping to be selected for work that day. Some were hired to carry heavy loads across town. Others hauled water from distant fountains or cleaned the refuse that accumulated in wealthier neighborhoods. There was no promise of employment. Some returned home with sore backs and empty pockets. For those who held stable work, cobblers, weavers, smiths, the rhythm was relentless. There were no weekends, no scheduled days of rest. Holidays existed, yes, but for many, they were days of uncertainty. Festivities meant hunger if the shops closed. The body learned to keep going, to bend, to lift, to mend, to remain alert, even through exhaustion. Rest was not a right. It was a luxury. Lunch, for most, came as the sun peaked, when the heat pressed heavy on the skin and the city pulsed with noise. It was a simple meal, eaten quickly, a piece of flatbread, perhaps olives, or a fig. There were no utensils, no plates. Food was held in the hands, consumed while sitting on a stone step under a patch of shadow, or in the cool of a doorway. The public eye was always watching. Morality was not a private matter. A man's behavior in the streets, his tone of voice, his choice of clothing, his punctuality, all were subject to judgment. There was a deep and constant awareness of reputation. One wrong gesture, one misspoken word, could spark gossip or shame that lingered longer than any bruise. Women, especially those without slaves, bore an added weight. They managed not only their own labor, spinning, weaving, fetching water, mending garments, but the burdens of caregiving, often alone. They carried children while tending fire, consoled the sick while bartering for grain, endured menstrual pain in silence while kneading bread. Their work was invisible, expected, and unceasing. Afternoons stretched on. The sun beat down on rooftops, made the air thick and difficult to breathe. Children, left to themselves, played with stones and sticks in the dust, or trailed behind their parents through crowded markets. There were no toys, no schools for most, no structured rest. A scraped knee, a swollen finger, a fever. These things came and went without bandages or balm. Evening brought little relief. After a long day, the same bread, perhaps a stew if there were beans or lentils, was shared among many. Families crouched on floors or sat on low stools. Lamps flickered dimly, the smell of oil clinging to their light. There was little conversation. Voices were low. Fatigue made the air heavy. And then sleep, but not silence. The nights in Rome were loud. Streets echoed with voices, animals, arguments, the clatter of carts returning from the countryside. In the upper floors of the insulae, where the roofs groaned and the wind crept through the walls, sleep was shallow. Beds were shared, blankets were coarse. The mind stayed half awake, alert for fire, for footsteps, for the cry of a sick child. And in the early hours, before the sky turned pale, the cycle began again. This was the life of those who did not command armies or draft laws. This was the routine of the many who history rarely mentions. They worked not for glory, but to eat. They endured not for ambition, but for survival. Their bodies broke silently. Their dreams, if they came at all, came in the flickering dark, before the coal embers faded and the city summoned them again. It is easy to forget them, but they were Rome, not in the statues or the scrolls, but in the hands that lifted the stone, in the backs that carried the weight, in the eyes that watched silently as another day began. The streets of Rome, lined with marble columns and grand arches, were paved with more than stone. Beneath the grandeur lay the slow echo of empty stomachs, millions of them. Because while the empire reached across continents and gold passed through its hands like water, hunger never truly left its heart. Even in the richest city of its time, food could be scarce and eating was never guaranteed. For the Roman poor, hunger was not a momentary discomfort. It was a presence, steady, silent, tightening the skin and hollowing the chest. It began in the morning with the absence of breakfast. Bread, if it was available, was broken and shared in small pieces, often stale from the day before. There was no milk, no eggs, no fruit for most. Water mixed with a little vinegar or diluted wine served more to soften the stomach's complaints than to nourish it. This dependence on grain, especially wheat, was central. The annona, the state's grain distribution program, was the lifeline for countless citizens. Through it, the empire provided subsidized or free grain, shipped from distant provinces, Egypt, North Africa, Sicily. Grain arrived in large quantities, carried by sea and unloaded in the bustling ports, to be processed, distributed, and eventually baked into bread that fed Rome's growing masses. But the system was fragile. A single failed harvest in Egypt could ripple through Rome like a silent storm. A storm at sea, a delay in shipping, corruption in a local warehouse, all could mean that the grain did not arrive on time or arrived in lesser quantities. Then the bread grew thinner, then the lines grew longer, then the people waited, and then they began to shout. Food riots were not uncommon. Crowds gathered in the forum, shouting at magistrates, demanding relief. Temples and granaries became sites of tension. Officials pleaded for patience. Sometimes the emperor himself would be called to intervene, and sometimes he would stand on a balcony and promise grain from his own reserves, knowing that his popularity and his life depended on the stomachs of strangers. Hunger in Rome was a tool. Bread was not simply sustenance, it was politics. The phrase bread and circuses, panem circense, captured this strategy. Feed the people just enough, entertain them with games, and they will remain docile. It was a form of control disguised as generosity. The distribution of grain was wrapped in ritual and spectacle. It was handed out publicly, with names recorded, quotas measured, the emperor's name inscribed on sacks like a divine signature. But what happened when there wasn't enough? People began to disappear into alleys, searching for scraps. Children wandered the streets with eyes wide, watching vendors, hoping for spoiled fruit or a crust too old to sell. Women cut small loaves into pieces so thin they dissolved in water. Men waited outside taverns for leftover broth, for bones, for anything warm. Even those who worked found themselves starving. Laborers burned calories faster than they could replace them. Artisans traded hours of precision for a coin that barely bought a meal, and in times of inflation, even that coin lost meaning. Hunger made the hours longer. It made tempers short. It made the world smaller. There were, of course, those who never knew such hunger. In the hills of Rome, in villas surrounded by servants, tables groaned with food. There was fish from distant coasts, figs out of season, wines aged in ceramic amphorae, and sauces flavored with garum, fermented fish liquid beloved by the elite. There were roasted peacocks, honeyed dormice, exotic fruits, platters so rich and heavy that guests reclined on their sides to eat, pausing only to relieve themselves before beginning again. The contrast was unbearable. Outside those homes, people watched. The smell of roasted meat drifted through the streets. The glimmer of oil lamps flickered behind thick curtains. Sometimes a slave discarded leftover food into the alley, and it was gone within moments. The line between survival and spectacle was thin, and many lived on its edge. Famine, when it came, did not announce itself with banners or thunder. It came quietly, slowly. A skipped meal, a longer line at the bakery, a whispered warning about rising prices, a ship that failed to arrive, a rumor about the granary running low. And then, like a flame catching dry straw, panic. Mothers gave their food to children. Fathers skipped meals for weeks. The old grew thin and faded. The weak died silently without notice, sometimes in corners, sometimes in crowds. Priests offered sacrifices. The state held its breath. And when the next shipment of grain finally arrived, it was not just welcomed, it was worshipped. Hunger shaped the soul of the city. It humbled even the proudest. It reminded Rome again and again that power does not silence the body's cry, that beneath the togas and titles, every stomach in the end is the same, empty when unfed, aching when ignored, desperate when forgotten, and in that ache, silent, shared, human, Rome revealed its truest self. In the quiet corners of Roman houses, behind thick walls that muffled sound but not fear, love often arrived not as a tender whisper, but as a calculated arrangement. Marriage in ancient Rome, especially among the citizen classes, was rarely a matter of affection. It was duty. It was alliance. It was property exchanged through vows and cemented with expectations far heavier than the gold rings exchanged. A Roman wife entered her husband's household not as an equal, but as a possession entrusted with bearing heirs and maintaining dignity. Her name, her voice, her body, all were absorbed into his. She crossed the threshold wearing a veil, not just as a symbol of modesty, but of surrender. And from that moment forward, her life unfolded under watchful eyes, his family's, the neighbors, the gods. Love, when it came, had to fit inside this cage. She might care for him, she might not. He might respect her, he might not. But devotion was never assumed, only enforced. And betrayal, especially by her, was not just personal, it was criminal. The Roman legal code treated female adultery as a public violation. A wife who strayed brought shame not only to her husband, but to the family line. Questions of paternity, inheritance, and honor bled into every accusation. A woman suspected of infidelity could be disowned, divorced without dowry, exiled, or even killed, with no need for trial if caught in the act. The law, cold and precise, granted a husband the right to take a life in defense of his reputation. Men, by contrast, were granted leniency. Their dalliances with prostitutes, slaves, or lower-class women were accepted, so long as they maintained appearances and avoided political scandal. The fidelity demanded of women was absolute. The fidelity expected of men was performative. Inside the household, this double standard grew into a quiet terror. Letters from the era, private graffiti, and preserved legal texts speak to a climate of suspicion. Love became surveillance. Husbands employed slaves to follow their wives. Mothers-in-law scrutinized every movement. A woman's friendships, her correspondence, her time outdoors, all were subject to comment, to doubt, to consequences. And if love withered in this environment, as it often did, it withered in silence. Some women pushed back, gently or defiantly. They wrote poetry under false names. They used fashion to communicate moods, veiling themselves in darker cloths, or letting strands of hair fall in calculated disarray. Some entered into affairs, risking everything for a moment of connection. Some were discovered, some vanished, and others died. Murder in Roman homes did not always come with a blade. It came in poison dropped into wine by a servant loyal to one side. It came in silence when a body disappeared and no one asked why. It came in public when a man brought his wife to trial for adultery and the forum watched and she stood alone. A man's rage could become a spectacle, a woman's pain, a lesson. There were stories whispered of noble women who fell in love with gladiators, of husbands who returned from war to find their homes changed and their wives colder, of wives who plotted together, exchanging notes in the folds of tunics, of children born with questions in their eyes and midwives paid to keep secrets. Yet not all households were battlegrounds. In quieter corners, away from politics and pride, there were couples who found gentleness, who, despite the rigid structure of Roman marriage, built something tender, who grew old together, not because they had to, but because they learned how. In the tomb inscriptions, one finds rare and aching declarations. She lived with me for 40 years, without quarrel, without shame. These are the exceptions. They shine more brightly for being so rare. Still, even in these cases, the weight of law and custom hovered nearby. A woman who loved too freely risked everything. A man who forgave too easily risked mockery. And children, watching it all, grew up learning that love could be dangerous, that trust could be punished, that silence could be safer than truth. This was the Roman home, a place of ritual and beauty, of banquets and lullabies, but also of fear, of suspicion, of control, dressed as devotion. Behind the heavy doors of those ancient houses, love and power were never far apart, and sometimes love was just another name for survival. In the great shadow of Rome's monuments, among the clamor of markets and the rhythm of daily labor, there were always children. Small feet ran across cobblestones, slick with morning rain. Thin voices echoed in courtyards, in alleyways, in stairwells high above the streets. And yet, behind the noise and play, a quieter truth held its breath. Many of these children would not grow old. Many would not even reach adolescence. The empire, for all its power and scale, was a place where childhood was not only fragile, but often fleeting. The statistics, if they had been written down, would have been brutal. It is estimated that in Rome, only half of all children lived beyond the age of 10. Disease, malnutrition, exposure, and violence made the earliest years of life perilous. A simple cough, a fever, a wound that festered in the summer heat. Any of these could mean an end before a name had time to be remembered. Even birth was uncertain. Not all newborns were welcomed into the world. In Roman society, the practice of exposure, the deliberate abandonment of infants, was common and socially accepted. A father, upon seeing a newborn placed at his feet, could choose to raise the child or to turn away. That turn, that silence, meant the child was to be left outside. No ritual, no burial, no words. Sometimes the child was left near a temple, a market wall, a rural path. If found, they might be taken in, not always from compassion but often for profit. Some were raised to be slaves, others trained for prostitution or sold again, their early abandonment shaping every breath of their brief lives. The law allowed it, the culture tolerated it, and for many women, particularly poor or enslaved ones, it was the only way to survive another mouth they could not feed. There was no word for trauma, no term for postpartum despair. But it hung in the air, invisible, yet dense. Midwives sometimes whispered warnings. Older women shared herbs, potions, quiet advice, but the weight remained. For those children who stayed, who were kept and named and fed, life was still hard. Their play, when it happened, was often rough. Games involved sticks, stones, and scraps of discarded tools. War was mimicked. Fights broke out. Pain was expected. Discipline was harsh. Belts, canes, sharp words that left no mark but lingered in the blood. A child was expected to obey, to learn their place early. Empathy was not encouraged. Endurance was. Many were put to work young. Boys might follow their fathers to job sites, carrying tools, learning trades, lifting burdens too heavy for their frames. Girls watched their mothers grind grain, tend fires, stitch torn tunics with hands not yet steady. They learned not just through words, but through silence, by watching, by being ignored until spoken to, by surviving long enough to be useful. And still, they loved. Children clung to older siblings. They cried for mothers lost in childbirth. They fell asleep to the rhythm of distant voices and the flicker of oil lamps. They touched statues and wondered at their stillness. They chased pigeons in temples. They stared up at the stars, not knowing the names of the gods who watched over them. Death came quietly, sometimes in sleep, sometimes in a fever that left the skin hot and the body limp. Often, no funeral followed. Among the poor, there was no money for rites, no stone to carve a name. Some bodies were buried in haste beyond the walls. Others disappeared into mass graves, or worse, were simply not recovered. The city moved on. And what of grief? What of mourning for those who never reached their first word, their first step, their first rebellion? Among the elite, there were rituals, small tombs, inscriptions of sorrow carved in stone. She lived 4 years, 7 months, and 16 days. These markers survive, but even then, mourning had boundaries. To weep too long was considered indulgent. To linger in loss was frowned upon. The empire had little patience for personal sorrow. For the poor, grief had no such ceremony. It sat in the silence after a lullaby was no longer needed. It lived in the empty space beside a shared blanket, in the absence of a small voice, in the shape of a name never spoken again. Grief became a daily companion. It shaped backs, tired from carrying both water and memory. And yet, the city did not pause. Children were born. Children disappeared. The wheels of empire turned. It is easy, from a distance, to romanticize the past, to imagine Rome as a place of greatness, of learning, of beauty. But beneath that beauty, there were countless tiny graves. There were toys never played with again, cradles left still, mothers who never smiled the same, fathers who learned not to look at the sky. In every room of that vast city, there was once a small voice, and in many, silence followed. Rome remembered its triumphs, but the children were often forgotten. Night in ancient Rome did not bring silence. It brought a different kind of noise, softer, but no less unsettling, The sharp clang of hammers gave way to hushed voices, the rustle of fabric, the creak of wooden shutters bracing against the wind. And behind the doors of even the wealthiest homes, sleep did not always come easily. Darkness, far from offering peace, was often a time of anxiety. For many Romans, to lie down at night was to enter a space where the boundary between the living and the unseen grew thin. Before the invention of electric light, darkness was thick. It had weight. It covered the city like a damp woolen cloak. Candles burned low, casting long and flickering shadows against walls. The flame of an oil lamp sputtered, sending curls of black smoke up into ceilings dark with soot. Even in homes that seemed secure, even with doors bolted and hearths warm, something in the air made rest uncertain. There were reasons, some practical, some imagined, all deeply felt. The architecture of Roman homes reflected this fear. Bedrooms, called cubicula, were often small and without windows. Designed to be quiet and private, they also trapped air and darkness. The walls, painted with bright frescoes, could not keep out the sense that something might be watching. In poorer homes, people slept several to a room, or in a single space used for eating, sleeping, mourning, and prayer. Sleep came not in comfort, but in intervals. There was the fear of fire. With wooden beams, oil lamps, and crowded tenements, a spark could destroy an entire block. Many slept lightly, ears trained for the first sound of crackling timber. And there was the fear of thieves, bold, quiet men who slipped between doorways and rooftops, prying open bolts with silent tools. But more than physical dangers, there was something older in the Roman night, something less visible, but no less present. They called them lemures, restless spirits of the dead, souls not properly buried, souls wronged, souls forgotten. These ghosts were believed to wander the night, tapping on windows, whispering through door cracks, chilling the backs of sleeping necks. Romans held festivals like Lemuria to appease them, tossing black beans over their shoulders in ritual offerings, chanting words meant to drive them away. Then there were the larvae, more malevolent. These were the spirits not only restless, but angry. Feared by all, they were thought to cause illness, nightmares, misfortune. And so, the home became a battlefield between the seen and the unseen, protected by rituals and objects meant to hold the darkness at bay. At the threshold of many homes, small images of the lares, household gods, stood guard. Offerings of wine, bread, and incense were left at their feet. Charms hung from doors, phallic amulets, bells, carved figures of animals or gods, all placed to protect the inhabitants from harm while they slept. Children were especially vulnerable. Mothers wrapped protective bands around their wrists, whispered incantations over cribs, left lights burning through the night. If a child woke crying, it was not dismissed. It was a sign of a bad dream, yes, but perhaps more. Perhaps a spirit had brushed past. Perhaps something unseen had paused too long near the bed. There were remedies, too. Recipes handed down in whispers, sleep draughts made from poppy seed and vinegar, herbal pillows filled with chamomile and rue. Prayers to Somnus, god of sleep. And when those failed, the restless simply lay still, watching the shadows move across the wall, listening to the distant noise of carts rumbling over stones, and hoping the dawn would come quickly. For slaves, sleep was even more fragile. Often forced to sleep near the doors they guarded or in corners of rooms they could never call their own, they were expected to wake at the slightest sound. Their rest was not sacred. Their dreams, if they came, were no one's concern, yet even among the privileged, even beneath fine blankets and painted ceilings, sleep was never certain. The body may lie down, but the mind did not always follow. It wandered, it feared, it listened. Perhaps this is what bound all Romans together, poor and rich, slave and senator, in the deep hours of the night. The quiet knowledge that no lock, no fire, no prayer could fully keep away what crept behind the veil of sleep. That beneath the weight of empire, everyone closed their eyes with caution. And when morning finally came, it was met not with joy, but with a slow exhale. Another night survived, another dawn allowed. The shadows withdrew, but the fear remained, waiting patiently for dusk to return. Because in ancient Rome, night did not promise rest. It promised the unknown. At first glance, the grandeur of ancient Rome dazzles. The wide stone roads, the imposing arches, the rhythmic colonnades that line the Forum. But beneath this architectural splendor, beyond the dusty stillness of ruins and the quiet hush of museums, Rome was not a silent city. It never was. In its time, it roared. And for those who lived within it, especially those without privilege, the noise was not simply background. It was a constant, inescapable presence that pressed against the senses like heat. Imagine waking not to birdsong, but to the clash of metal. Blacksmiths began work before dawn, hammering iron with relentless precision. Street vendors shouted their wares, each louder than the next, competing for the ears of weary buyers. Bread, fish, dried fruit, salt, wine. Their voices layered one over the other until meaning dissolved into sound. In the background, the barking of dogs, the cries of infants, and the rasp of wooden wheels over stone never stopped. Carts creaked and groaned through narrow streets. Horses snorted and stamped. Public announcements echoed from couriers reading decrees aloud in open spaces. Priests chanted in temples. Actors shouted in open-air theaters. And from time to time, a scuffle erupted. Two merchants in a quarrel, a drunk soldier demanding passage, a pickpocket caught mid-act. Noise was a kind of weather, always present, changing in intensity, but never truly gone. The insula, the tall, precarious apartment blocks, magnified every sound. Walls were thin, floors creaked, voices bled through rooms. Someone sneezed 2 floors up, and the echo reached your bed. A child cried across the courtyard, and the sound curled through the rafters like smoke. The wooden stairs groaned beneath hurried feet. Doors slammed. Water splashed from a rooftop cistern. Somewhere, always, a dog barked. At night, the volume changed, but never faded. The clamor of daytime markets gave way to the murmurs of taverns where lamps flickered and laughter mingled with threats. Fights broke out in the dark. Thieves moved with purpose, their footsteps light, but their impact loud. The wind whistled through shutters. Somewhere, a man groaned in pain or pleasure or both. Sleep was not the silence of peace, but the exhaustion of surrender. Even in temples meant for reflection, noise lingered. Bells rang, ritual chants echoed against stone. Incense burned audibly, crackling in censers. Pilgrims whispered prayers, some sobbing, some shouting in desperation. The gods were listening, but so was everyone else. There was no escape, no countryside for most, no secluded rooms. Quiet was a privilege, and one rarely granted. The very concept of solitude, of auditory stillness, was foreign to many. The city did not pause. The city did not hush. The city pulsed, and the body responded. Tension lodged in shoulders, in jaws, in clenched fists. Children grew up flinching at sudden noises. Adults learned to filter sound like water through cloth, never clear, only manageable. But the toll remained. Sleeplessness, irritability, headaches. These were not named as syndromes or diagnoses. They were simply life. Some tried to create islands of stillness. Wealthier Romans, when possible, retreated to country villas. There, surrounded by fields and birdsong, they wrote poems about the peace of nature, the blessings of silence. For the rest, small rituals offered moments of quiet, lighting a lamp, washing one's hands in cool water, listening to the flames flicker, to the slow scratch of a stylus over wax. Not silence, but softness. Even among the poorest, there were strategies. Covering one's head with fabric while sleeping, humming low to drown out others, rocking infants not with lullabies but with steady whispered breaths. Silence had to be invented, moment by moment, in a city that refused to offer it. And yet, in the heart of all this noise, people still lived, still loved, still dreamed. They whispered secrets to each other in doorways, in stairwells, in alleys behind bakeries. They carved soft words into stone. They closed their eyes and imagined the sea or the wind and trees they would never see. They found a kind of rhythm in the chaos, a way to breathe through the noise, to exist inside it without disappearing. Because in ancient Rome, silence was not absence, it was resistance. In the marble echoes of ancient Rome, where statues of God stood proudly unclothed in temples and plazas, the naked body was not hidden. It was not whispered about behind closed doors, nor draped in shame. Instead, it was exposed, examined, displayed, and, more often than not, simply accepted. The Roman world did not share modern notions of privacy or modesty. It moved to different rhythms, where nudity was woven into daily life not as rebellion, but as routine. Nowhere was this more visible than in the public baths. The thermae, vast complexes of heated rooms, cold pools, steam chambers, and exercise yards, were not just places for washing. They were centers of Roman social life. People came to cleanse their bodies, yes, but also to discuss politics, seal business deals, recite poetry, flirt, gossip, argue, and observe. They came naked, or nearly so, regardless of age, gender, or class. Upon entering, visitors disrobed without hesitation. Slaves took their garments, storing them in small cubicles or simply laying them in piles. The body, exposed to dozens or hundreds of others, was not judged by its perfection. Fat bodies, thin bodies, scarred, aging, adolescent, all mingled in the same water, sat on the same stone benches, endured the same heat. There was no veil of modesty to shield from scrutiny. There was no need. Cleanliness here was ritual. Before entering the pools, bathers would scrape their skin with a curved metal tool called a strigil, removing oil, sweat, and dust. It was not always gentle. It left red lines. The body was scrubbed with pumice, doused in water, massaged with perfumed oil. Touch was part of the process, received without comment, often administered by slaves whose own bodies bore the wear of labor. And as the body was cleaned, it was also observed. The male gaze governed much of public life in Rome, and the baths were no exception. Conversations paused to assess another's physique. Laughter followed those deemed too thin, too fat, too hairy, too old. Jokes circulated about sagging flesh and drooping skin. Caricatures of deformity became entertainment. Yet paradoxically, none of this discouraged presence. The expectation was participation. For women, the experience was more complex. In some cities, and during certain periods, men and women bathed at different times or in separate areas. In others, mixed bathing occurred. Nudity, even then, was not rare. What mattered was status. Who could speak, who could act, who could judge without being judged in return. Fashion outside the baths reflected similar attitudes. Roman garments, such as the tunic or stola, were often loose and semi-transparent in summer months. Togas were heavy and cumbersome, worn mostly by men of status. But beneath them there was often little else. The lines of the body were visible in movement, in wind, in heat. Underwear existed, but was not always worn. Eroticism in Rome did not depend on concealment. It thrived in suggestion, in gesture, in the knowing exchange of glances. Art and graffiti in Pompeii and other preserved sites depict bodies in positions of intimacy, but also in laughter, in awkwardness, in casual nudity. There was no sharp division between sacred and profane when it came to flesh. Still, the body was not free. It was judged. It was used. It was politicized. A well-muscled frame spoke of discipline. A soft belly could signal wealth or laziness. A woman's figure was expected to align with ideals set by those who viewed her, not those who lived within her skin. The freedom of nudity was shaped by the structure of power. Slaves, of course, had no choice. Their bodies were not their own. Stripped not only of clothing, but of autonomy, they were bathed, inspected, touched, punished. Their nudity was not shared but taken, not social but subjugated, and yet, within this world of visibility, many Romans moved with ease. The idea of hiding the body, of shielding skin from sunlight and scrutiny, would have seemed strange. Even the statues that lined villas and forums, Venus stepping from her bath, Hercules with his lion skin, reflected a culture that did not turn away. Perhaps in the Roman world, nudity was not a statement. It was simply a condition of life. To walk among others with one's body revealed was not scandalous. It was ordinary. It was daily. It was part of the rhythm of a society that understood the body as both vessel and symbol, as something seen, touched, used, and eventually discarded. Not sacred, not shameful, just there. And so, amid the steam, the laughter, the chatter of the bathhouses, the naked body passed unnoticed until it didn't. Until it betrayed desire, until it bore shame, until it became a target. But for most of the time it simply existed, uncovered, unhidden, and completely Roman. Behind the grandeur of Roman temples and the noise of its forums, beyond the reach of marble statues and public debates, there were rooms where women moved softly, their lives unfolded in spaces both sacred and invisible, spaces shaped not by what they could do, but by what they could not. Though Roman women breathed the same air, walked the same stones, and watched the same sky as their male counterparts, their worlds were smaller, bound not by walls alone, but by expectations etched deep into the culture's core. A Roman woman, especially one of free status, was raised to obey. Obedience was not framed as submission, but as honor. To stay indoors was not confinement, it was virtue. The ideal matrona, the Roman matron, was defined not by voice or action, but by absence. She was quiet, discreet, veiled when stepping outside. Her steps were short, her gaze lowered. She might oversee a household of dozens, manage resources, supervise slaves, raise children, but all of this from behind the threshold. Respect in Rome was not granted to women who spoke loudly. It was reserved for those who disappeared gracefully. Her clothing mirrored this paradox. A woman of status wore a stola, long, layered, draped. It announced her respectability. But it also restricted movement, signaling that her place was not in the public square, but within the home. Beneath the folds of fabric, however, her choices mattered. Colors, textures, jewelry, all became quiet tools of expression. A brighter hem, a carefully chosen brooch. These were whispers of autonomy in a world that offered few ways to speak. Yet the body, for a Roman woman, was never truly hers. From the moment of puberty, she became a vessel, first for the family's reputation, then for a husband's lineage. Her fertility was not private. It was measured, awaited, and judged. Failure to conceive brought blame. A swelling belly brought relief. Stillbirths and miscarriages were mourned in silence, often alone, without ritual or recognition. Her womb was both hope and burden. And with it came rituals. Menstruation was not a neutral fact. It was feared, misunderstood, and surrounded by superstition. Blood, in Roman thought, carried power. Menstrual blood especially was thought to spoil wine, blunt steel, wither crops, and cause disease. A woman bleeding was not ill, but she was other. Some texts warned against touching her, others recommended isolation. And still, daily life continued. Bread had to be baked, children held, prayers whispered over fire. These contradictions shaped her inner world. There were goddesses who watched over her: Juno, protector of marriage; Vesta, guardian of the hearth. And there were rituals led by women. For women, festivals where they prayed for fertility, for safe childbirth, for peace in the home. These were moments when the veil lifted slightly, when women gathered together in sacred space, away from the gaze of men. But danger never fully retreated. A woman accused of adultery could be divorced, humiliated, exiled. A woman accused of sorcery could be beaten or killed. A widow without family might lose her home. An orphaned girl might be married off at 12. These outcomes were not aberrations. They were possibilities woven into the fabric of law and life. And yet, within these confines, women lived full, complex lives. They wrote when permitted. Some penned poetry, letters, prayers, often unsigned, often lost. Others managed businesses in their husband's absence, negotiated dowries, or ran inns and shops. In some cases, they even owned property, lent money, or freed slaves. These acts were not celebrated, but they happened. Quiet rebellions, daily survivals. And within the home, bonds were formed between mothers and daughters, between wet nurses and the children they nurtured, between slave women who shared rooms, secrets, dreams. Laughter was exchanged over shared labor. Grief over lost children or broken love was passed from hand to hand like folded linens. The private world of Roman women was not silent. It only seemed so to those who never stopped to listen. It pulsed with emotion, with endurance, with rituals done in the dark. It hummed beneath the sound of public speeches and the clang of soldiers' boots. It moved in the rustle of fabric, in the flick of a veil, in the scent of oil applied before dawn. And even though history rarely carved their names in stone, they left traces in lullabies, in recipes, in footsteps that shaped the dust of every Roman home. They endured, and they remembered, even when no one asked them to. In a city filled with temples, fountains, and public baths where marble shone in the sun and senators debated beneath vaulted ceilings, sickness still crept in. It moved through the veins of Rome quietly, steadily, indifferent to wealth or status. A cough here, a fever there, a wound that did not close. And when it came, when illness made the body weak and unfamiliar, Romans turned to medicine. But their medicine was not what we imagine. It was not gentle. It was not clean. And it was often far more dangerous than the disease itself. Roman medicine, shaped by Greek theories and local superstitions, was built on the belief in balance, specifically the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness was thought to come not from infection or contamination, but from imbalance. Too much blood might cause fever. Too little might lead to fatigue. The solution? Drain the excess, add what was missing, restore the imagined symmetry. Bloodletting was common. A patient, whether child or elder, might be cut with a small knife, the blood allowed to flow until pallor set in, or dizziness began. Sometimes leeches were applied, other times hot cups or sharp instruments. The pain was sharp. The after effects often worse, but it was prescribed with certainty, performed by physicians or, in poorer homes, by family or slaves. Laxatives and emetics were also favored. Vomiting was seen as a cleansing act, not only of the stomach, but of the soul. Patients were given mixtures of vinegar, salt, herbs, and even ashes to induce purging. It was unpleasant, it was exhausting, and it was believed to be necessary. Then there were the more elaborate remedies. Pliny the Elder, a respected Roman writer, listed treatments that included crushed beetles, ashes of burnt dog, and the gall of a wild boar. Wounds might be cleaned with wine or urine, toothaches soothed with burned mouse skulls, baldness treated with a paste of crushed ants, snakeskin, spider webs, goat fat. Nothing was considered too strange if it promised relief. And in some corners of the empire, even darker prescriptions prevailed. It was whispered that the blood of a gladiator could cure epilepsy, that the liver of a recently deceased man might strengthen the weak, that the warm breath of a dying animal could chase away fever. These were not fringe beliefs. They were accepted truths, passed from physician to patient with solemn faces and steady hands. Surgery existed, but was brutal. There was no anesthesia, only alcohol, opium in rare cases, or the strength of assistants holding a body still. Tools were sharp and made of bronze or iron. Hooks, knives, saws. Cauterization was used to stop bleeding, the iron heated in fire, then pressed to skin. The smell of burning flesh, the scream of the patient, the silence that followed, these were part of the practice. And yet, many endured it, because pain in Rome was not seen as something to be eliminated. It was something to be survived, a test, a rite. Something to be borne without complaint, especially for men, and in dignified silence for women. Children were expected to grit their teeth, the elderly to accept their fading strength without fuss. Physicians, called medici, varied greatly in skill. Some were educated, trained in Alexandria or Athens, well-read in Galen and Hippocrates. Others were former slaves or midwives who learned through observation and experience. Some charged large sums, others worked for bread. And among them all, mistakes were common: misdiagnoses, wrong dosages, accidents during surgery, death unexpected but accepted. There were also healers outside the formal system, women who brewed teas of chamomile, mint, or rue, men who applied poultices made from clay and ash, elders who chanted over wounds. Some claimed visions, others relied on trial and error. They treated burns, helped with childbirth, soothed sore joints. Their work was often dismissed by the elite, but trusted by neighbors. For the poor, medicine was largely inaccessible. They relied on the kindness of others, on prayers, on rest that never came, on herbs grown in cracked pots. They nursed one another, and when the body failed, they buried their dead without tombs, without ceremony, without stone. And still, the empire carried on. People lived in pain, quietly, persistently. They walked to the markets with aching knees, worked with inflamed joints, labored through coughs and migraines. They endured stomach ailments, infected wounds, broken bones. They whispered to gods. They lit lamps at shrines. They wrapped themselves in wool and hoped for warmth. The body, fragile and sacred, was both temple and battlefield. Medicine, as practiced then, was less about healing and more about survival, about doing something, anything, to fight back against what could not be named or understood. And in that struggle, in the mixtures of hope and harm, one sees not just the ignorance of an ancient world, but its humanity, the desperate desire to feel better, to stay alive, to see one more dawn, even when it hurt. In the dim candlelight of a Roman triclinium, the formal dining room of the elite, there is no sound of forks scraping plates, no clinking of silver against porcelain. Instead, the room hums with the low murmur of conversation, the occasional laugh of a reclining guest, the wet rhythmic sound of fingers dipped into bowls, and the dull splash of wine being poured again and again. The Roman banquet was not just a meal, it was an exhibition, a ritual of consumption. A performance of abundance so exaggerated it blurred the line between pleasure and punishment. Food in ancient Rome was never merely sustenance. It was a symbol of class, of control, of the distance between those who dined reclining and those who stood silently behind them, waiting with platters. The poor ate quickly, quietly, often standing. But for the wealthy, food was part of a language, a tool, a spectacle. Guests at a Roman feast reclined on couches, lying on their left sides, propped by cushions, their right hands free to reach for food. There were no utensils, only fingers and the occasional spoon. The fingers were everything. They pinched olives, scooped sauces, peeled fruit, tore bread, and brought rich morsels directly to the lips. Hands were wiped on cloths or on the hair of a nearby slave. Napkins, if used, were not personal. The courses were endless. It began with the gustatio, starters meant to awaken appetite. Eggs, lettuce, shellfish, radishes with garum, a fermented fish sauce beloved by Romans despite its sharp, pungent scent. Then came the prima mensa, the main course, roasted meats, fish layered in herbs, pigeons stuffed with nuts, wild boar drizzled with honey, and finally the secunda mensa, desserts of fruit, sweet wine, and pastries, dates stuffed with almonds, figs baked with cheese, each dish more elaborate than the last. But it was not enough to eat. One had to prove that one could continue eating far beyond the point of fullness. Vomiting was not an accident. It was an intermission. Between courses, some guests quietly excused themselves to empty their stomachs. Not in shame, but in ritual. In specially designated spaces, latrines near dining rooms or basins behind curtains, they relieved themselves of the weight of what they had consumed, so they could begin again. Some carried feathers used to stimulate the throat. Others relied on emetics taken before arrival. It was not uncommon. It was expected. To refuse food was to offend. To leave a plate untouched was to insult the host. To vomit and return was to participate fully, a grotesque courtesy. And all the while the performance continued. Dancers swayed to the tune of pipes, poets recited verses between bites, slaves moved silently, replacing platters, pouring wine, fanning guests, adjusting lamps. Their own stomachs, often empty, were of no concern. Their presence, essential yet invisible, kept the banquet flowing. Conversation, too, was strategic. Politics, philosophy, gossip. Guests navigated each topic with care, aware that a single comment could elevate or destroy. The banquet was both indulgence and game, a stage where alliances were formed, marriages hinted at, and rivalries sharpened under the sweet glaze of a honeyed dish. And yet, beneath the glittering trays and perfumed oils, something else stirred. A quiet desperation, the need to prove status through consumption, the emptiness that chased satisfaction, the loneliness behind the laughter. Some guests, drunk on both wine and spectacle, spoke too freely. Some grew ill and were carried out. Some sat in silence, swallowing not only food but their own fatigue. The body can only take so much. Outside, in the streets below, others ate in shadows. Flatbread dipped in oil, lentils scooped with rough fingers, a single fig cherished and divided. There was no performance, only hunger, only necessity. And so the Roman feast, so often remembered as grand, was also deeply grotesque. A ritual of excess in a world where many had nothing, a celebration of gluttony in a city haunted by famine, a theater of pleasure framed by the quiet suffering of those who made it possible. To eat was human, but to feast in Rome was something else. It was a declaration, a mask, a mirror held up to the empire's soul. And in that mirror, one saw both the opulence and the emptiness. In the still corners of ancient Rome, away from the clang of the forges and the clamor of the baths, there were rooms filled with silence. The kind of silence that hums with concentration, with the slow, steady scratch of metal stylus on wax, with the rustle of scrolls unrolling, the murmur of breath drawn in as a hand pauses, then continues. In those rooms, knowledge was copied, letter by letter, line by line, not with pride, but with discipline, and often with pain. The scribes and copyists of Rome were not authors. Their job was not to invent, but to preserve. They reproduced texts, legal decrees, philosophical treatises, commercial records, religious prayers, letters, and literary works. In doing so, they held the future in their hands, even as their own names faded into obscurity. The work was slow. By candlelight or by slivers of natural daylight admitted through narrow windows, a scribe would bend over his table, ink pot at the ready, reed pen carefully trimmed. Papyrus was expensive and brittle. Mistakes were costly. Each word had to be right, each stroke precise, eyes strained, backs curved, hours passed unnoticed, punctuated only by the sound of ink being stirred or a quiet sigh escaping tired lungs. They wrote in Latin, in Greek, in the shorthand of legal clerks and the longhand of poets. They copied not only words but margins, spacing, punctuation, or the lack of it. A misplaced stroke could alter meaning entirely. A single drop of ink could turn praise into insult, law into error, blessing into curse. Some were slaves taught to write by necessity. Others were freedmen, educated enough to be useful, but never free from repetition. In large households, scribes worked in designated rooms surrounded by stacks of documents. In government offices, they sat in rows, transcribing edicts. In temples, they copied sacred texts. And in schools, they prepared the exercises that future scribes would memorize by rote. Their tools were simple: reed pens dipped in dark ink made from soot and gum, wax tablets used for drafts or temporary notes, papyrus scrolls, sometimes several meters long, requiring careful rolling and unrolling. The smell of ink was always present, sharp, earthy, a mixture of ash and resin. Fingers were often stained black, nails chipped, wrists cramped from the strain of holding one position for hours. Silence was essential. Talking could lead to mistakes. Distraction was dangerous. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. And still, mistakes happened. When they did, they were scraped off with a knife, or blotted out with fresh ink, or if too many, the scroll was discarded altogether. A day's work wasted. No apology, just the weight of time lost and the pressure to begin again. For copyists of literary texts, the task carried extra weight. A single scribe might spend months copying one manuscript, transferring the words of Cicero, Virgil, or Ovid onto a fresh scroll. His eyes would move over each line, translating it into movement, into ink, into permanence. But rarely did he read for pleasure. The beauty of the words passed through his fingers, not through his heart. The physical toll was immense. Scribes complained of blurred vision, aching necks, and trembling hands. Some went blind from years of labor. Others developed sores on their elbows or knees from long hours kneeling. The work demanded discipline, not just of body but of mind. Distraction could not be allowed. Fatigue was swallowed, pain was ignored, and there was no fame. The author's name was remembered, the sponsor's name carved in stone. The scribe's identity vanished. Some, in a rare moment of rebellion, left quiet notes in the margins, small prayers, small complaints. "I have finished. This was hard. May the gods preserve me." These lines, invisible to most, were small acts of humanity. The work they did was invisible to those who used it. A contract signed with a flourish, unaware of the hours it took to draft. A poem recited at a dinner party, disconnected from the hand that copied it with aching fingers. A sermon read aloud passed through the quiet labor of someone whose own beliefs may have remained unspoken, and yet, without them, nothing would remain. Rome wrote with blood, not just in war, but in silence, in ink that stained fingertips and scrolls that bore the burden of memory. The scribes who copied history were rarely allowed to shape it, but they held it for a time, cradled it, preserved it, and then they disappeared into the margins. In ancient Rome, belief was not a private matter. It was a spectacle, woven into every ceremony, every decision, every breath drawn beneath the gaze of the gods. The Roman world pulsed with devotion, but it was not the quiet personal faith of whispered prayers and solitary candles. It was loud, collective, public, and often beneath its order and ritual there was fear. The gods were everywhere, in temples, in doorways, in kitchens, in the marketplace. Every hill, every stream, every tree could be sacred. Every action before planting, before travel, before war was preceded by prayer. But these prayers were not conversations. They were negotiations, contracts, offers. I give so that you may give. The Roman pact with the divine was transactional. Break it, and the gods would not simply turn away, they would punish. And so religion became anxiety, dressed in ritual. Animal sacrifices were routine. Oxen, pigs, sheep, chosen carefully, washed, decorated with ribbons, were led into public spaces, surrounded by chanting priests and silent crowds. The animal had to show no fear. A trembling limb could mean the ritual was flawed. Once slain, its entrails were inspected, steaming and red, their curves and colors red like words. The liver, especially, was sacred. A blemish might suggest divine displeasure. A perfect shape might reassure. But what if the signs were wrong? What if the gods were already offended? To the Roman mind, anything could be a bad omen. A thunderclap in clear skies, a birth at an unlucky hour, a crow flying against the wind. Dreams especially carried meaning, a loved one drowning, teeth falling out, fire that could not be touched. These were not dismissed, they were recorded, interpreted by augurs and soothsayers, whose entire role was to read the will of the divine through symbols that defied logic. And with every sign came a response. Rituals were repeated. Statues were cleansed with milk or wine. Processions were held. Sacred texts, like the Sibylline books, were consulted in times of crisis. Kept under lock by state priests, these oracles were only opened when the city trembled during famine, plague, war. The instructions they offered could be cryptic. Build a temple to a foreign god. Sacrifice 10 animals at dawn. Bury something in silence. And the people obeyed. Not from love, but from terror. The gods of Rome were not gentle. They were powerful, distant, demanding. Jupiter throned in storm clouds, Mars red with blood, Pluto watching from beneath the earth. Even the household gods, Lares and Penates, required offerings. Wine poured on the hearth, crumbs set aside at meals. Forget them, and illness might enter, death might follow. Religion permeated everything. Weddings were not legal without proper rites. Contracts were signed under divine witness. Soldiers carried sacred emblems into battle. Every emperor claimed divine favor or divinity itself. Augustus was not just a ruler, he was a son of a god. To question this was not just treason, it was blasphemy. And when disaster struck, as it often did, flood, plague, fire, the blame was not on nature, it was on human failure. Someone had angered the gods, someone had spoken the wrong words, offered the wrong gift, or worse, nothing at all. Panic spread. Sacrifices multiplied. Some prayed louder. Others fasted, and some turned inward, terrified that their private doubts had caused public ruin. Even festivals carried tension. The Saturnalia, a winter feast of reversal and freedom, where slaves dined like masters, where laughter replaced order, was followed by a return to strict normalcy. The Lupercalia, wild and sacred, saw half-naked men running through the streets, striking women with goat-hide whips for fertility. These were not simply celebrations. They were desperate dances meant to hold the world together, because the world felt always on the edge. Rome was mighty, yes, but also fragile. Beneath its triumphs lay earthquakes, plagues, political unrest. And through it all, the people turned again and again to ritual, not because they believed it would always work, but because the alternative, silence, chaos, abandonment, was unthinkable. Religion in Rome was not about hope. It was about survival, control, reassurance carved into stone. Order drawn from entrails, and fear, always fear, threaded through every offering, every hymn, every gaze lifted toward the sky. It was not comfort they sought. It was safety, even if only for one more day. There are moments in ancient Rome when the scent of something sacred rises above the rot. A curl of smoke drifting from an altar, the sharp sweetness of crushed myrrh, burned before a household god. The cloying aroma of rose oil dabbed gently behind an ear, layered over days of unwashed skin. In a city so overwhelmed by human presence, where sewage ran beneath marble and breath hung thick in every corridor, scent became more than adornment. It became survival, a mask, a boundary between the sacred and the spoiled. To live in Rome was to live with smell. The city reeked of life, bodies packed tightly in tenements, meat rotting under the sun, fish laid bare on market stalls, horses sweating under loads of stone. There were no waste systems that truly contained the waste. The air carried it all. It clung to skin, to fabric, to memory, and in that air, scent took on power. Incense was not decoration, it was protection. In temples it burned in great clouds. Frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, storax. It billowed from bronze censers, spiraling toward statues with blank eyes and open palms. The smoke, thick and sweet, coated nostrils, filled lungs, masked the blood beneath the rituals. It was a signal to the gods, yes, but also a shield for the people. A way to purify space, to push back against decay. In homes, the practice was quieter. A handful of resin tossed into the brazier before sleep. A sprig of mint or rue hung by the door, a touch of perfume before visitors arrived. These were small acts of dignity, fragile walls built against the tide of odor and illness that constantly pressed in. Perfume, too, held meaning. The wealthy anointed themselves with oils imported from Arabia, India, North Africa. Rose, spikenard, saffron, cardamom, precious liquids kept in glass vials applied with delicate fingers. A woman's neck, a man's beard, the inside of a wrist. These were not just for beauty. They were statements of refinement, of distance from the laboring classes whose sweat was never sweetened, whose oil was olive, not spiced. But perfumes also deceived. They masked fever. They disguised infection. A body in decline could be made to seem vital. A mouth soured by illness could still breathe sweetness. The line between health and death blurred behind a veil of scent. And sometimes, the more someone reeked of perfume, the more desperate the attempt to hide what lingered beneath. In funerals, scent played yet another role. The dead were washed and anointed, their bodies wrapped not only in cloth but in fragrance, cypress, bay leaves. Incense burned continuously to overpower the odor of decay. Mourners carried bundles of aromatic herbs. The air was filled with the smell of grief mixed with oil and smoke. Even in death, Rome feared the return of the body to the earth too quickly. It tried to slow the rot, to sweeten the end. And in brothels, in the quarters of pleasure and commerce, perfume was applied thickly, not just to seduce, but to survive, to create a space where illusion could flourish, where a man might forget the open sores on a lover's skin or the rattle in her breath, where the sharp tang of fear could be overpowered by jasmine or cinnamon, if only for a moment. Scent was not superficial. It was a language, one of memory, of class, of power. To smell good was to be clean, refined, touched by luxury. To smell foul was to be shamed, ignored, discarded. Children were taught early to recognize these signals, to lean into one scent, to flinch from another. A well-scented room promised safety, a foul one, danger, and still, in every corner, the stench returned. Because incense faded, perfume wore off, smoke dissipated, and underneath the city breathed on, warm, rank, alive. The sacred smells did not erase the rot. They simply made it bearable, covered it in ritual, made it poetic. But the people of Rome, whether they whispered prayers through clouds of myrrh or dabbed oil beneath their arms before stepping into the crowd, knew the truth. The body fails, the city spoils, the scent always returns. But for a few moments, through smoke and spice, they could pretend it didn't. They could breathe something finer and believe, just for a breath, that they were clean, that the gods would not smell their fear, and maybe would look away. The bathhouses of ancient Rome were not quiet places. They breathed, they hissed, they echoed. Entering a therme was like stepping into a body itself, warm, pulsing, wet. Stone walls sweated under the weight of steam, and every surface seemed to exhale. The air was thick with the mingled scents of sweat, oil, smoke, mildew, and something sourer, something older. The baths were meant for cleansing, but they were also spaces of contradiction, places where luxury met labor, where bodies were revealed and forgotten in equal measure. A typical Roman bathhouse was vast, not merely a room, but a sequence of experiences, each one shaping the body differently. There was the apoditerium, the changing room, where clothes were removed and identity softened. Then the palaestra, the exercise yard, where muscles flexed and sweat began. Then came the caldarium, hot and heavy, where the air clung to the lungs like a damp sheet. The tepidarium, warm and quiet. The frigidarium, cold and sharp like river water in winter, pools lined in mosaic, ceilings vaulted, lamps flickering, their flames wavering through vapor. Here, Romans did not bathe in solitude. They moved in crowds, elbow to elbow, flesh against flesh. Nudity was expected, casual, communal. Women bathed separately or at alternate times, depending on the rules of the city, the hour, the emperor. Slaves accompanied their owners not to bathe, but to serve, to scrub, to hold towels, to apply oils, to carry the weight of others' comfort. For the rich, the baths were leisure, a place to display the body, to engage in politics, to flirt, to listen to poetry, or argue over law. For the poor, they were a reprieve from filth, a rare taste of warmth in a life ruled by cold and fatigue. For the enslaved, they were labor and observation. But for all, they were physical, inescapably so. The body was handled, scraped with strigils, curved metal tools used to drag sweat and dirt from skin. The process was not gentle. It left red streaks, sometimes welts. The strigil did not discriminate. It scraped illness, age, and youth alike. The skin it removed fell into the water or onto the floor to be swept away later by servants who bore no illusions about hygiene. And the danger was real. The floors, perpetually slick with oil and moisture, turned even the smallest misstep into injury. Elderly men, stiff from years of work or warfare, slipped. Young boys running from room to room collided and cracked bones. There were no railings, no soft edges. Marble is beautiful, but it does not forgive. In the caldarium, the heat could grow unbearable. The body sweated and swelled. Blood pounded in the temples. Breathing grew shallow. For some, this heat was release. For others, it was the final strain. There are records, few, fragmented, of men collapsing during a massage, of fainting mid-sentence, of being carried out by friends or slaves, eyes fluttering, lips pale. Some revived, some did not. And then there was the silence of death that went unnoticed. A man leaning too long against a wall. A woman submerged in a cool bath, not rising. An elder who simply didn't return from the tepidarium. In a place so full of noise, of water lapping and voices rising, a body could grow still without being seen, especially the poor, especially the tired. Their deaths did not disrupt the rituals. A body removed was just another task. The diseases, too, found easy passage here. There were no filters, no knowledge of germs. The same water served dozens, even hundreds. Wounds were cleaned in communal pools. The strigils passed from one back to another. Towels were rinsed, not washed. Skin touched skin. Feet shared fungus. Boils festered. Coughs echoed and multiplied. The water carried things deeper than dirt. But the illusion held, the illusion of purification, of civilization, of order. Rome needed this illusion. It needed its people to believe in control, in ritual, in the taming of the human form through marble and heat. And so the baths were built bigger, grander, the friezes more detailed, the pools more symmetrical. Statues of Apollo, Venus, Neptune watched from their pedestals, gods of beauty, of healing, of the sea. They did not blink, they did not speak when a child drowned in the frigidarium, slipping quietly beneath the water, unseen. They did not weep when a slave collapsed in the boiler room, throat scorched by steam. They bore witness, and they said nothing. Because the baths were not just spaces of luxury, they were mirrors. They showed Rome to itself, the body as instrument, the body as object, the body as waste. Those who could afford it returned again and again, to sweat, to scrape, to soak, to pretend that they could wash off the weight of the world, that oil and perfume could erase the stench of fear or age or sorrow, that heat could chase away death, that marble could make the flesh forget its own limits. But beneath the fragrance of crushed herbs, beneath the laughter, beneath the glint of torchlight on wet skin, the truth remained. The body breaks, even in water, even in marble, even in Rome. It is late afternoon in ancient Rome. The sun casts a molten gold across the tiled roofs, but in the shaded corridors of the insula, the working-class apartment blocks, there is laughter rising sharp and sudden. It drifts through narrow alleys and over the heads of market sellers, slipping into courtyards where children mimic the stoop of a hunchback or the faltering step of a drunk. The laughter is not kind, it is not warm. It stings, even when it doesn't mean to. To laugh in Rome was to assert a kind of power, and far too often that power was drawn from the bodies of others. The streets of the empire were full of imperfection. Battered by labor, illness, hunger, or accident, the Roman body bore the marks of a life lived without cushions. The line between able and disabled was both sharply drawn and constantly shifting. A fall in the forum, a fever left untreated, a wound that festered. Any of these could take a man from citizen to spectacle. In a society where strength and control were ideals, the body that could not perform became either burden or joke. Roman humor loved targets. And it found them, especially in those whose appearances deviated from the sculpted norms chiseled into marble, in the crooked, the small, the twisted, in hunched backs and clubbed feet, in stutters, lisped speech, missing teeth. The city's humor did not spare, it did not whisper. On the stage in the bawdy comedies of Plautus and Terence, physical deformity was shorthand for foolishness, or lust, or gluttony. The audience did not need subtlety. A character walked with a limp, and the crowd leaned forward, already smiling. Their laughter echoed across stone amphitheaters, open, casual, unkind. The actors wore masks with exaggerated features, their painted faces designed to provoke derision before a word was even spoken. But this cruelty lived offstage, too. Wealthy homes often kept dwarfs and people with physical differences as part of their domestic entertainment. These individuals were not merely servants, they were curiosities. Brought out during feasts to make guests laugh, to dance, to stumble, to be pointed at. Their very presence was performance. Their bodies became objects of fascination, of amusement, rarely of respect. Slaves with deformities were often branded with humiliating nicknames, names that reduced them to a single characteristic: crooked, stammer, half-face. These names were used casually, repeated by children, woven into songs. And the songs in turn were passed through generations, laughter blooming along the wounds. Even within families, jokes about bodily failure were not rare. A child slow to speak, a father whose hand shook, a mother whose back bent early. There was no softness around these changes, only observation and the uncomfortable need to name what was different. To name it aloud was to control it or pretend to. On the streets, performers mimicked these same traits. Jugglers, mimes, traveling actors, they imitated the blind, the toothless, the shaking. They exaggerated the stagger of the epileptic, the shriek of a woman giving birth. They did it for coins, for attention, for a place to sleep. And the public responded. The louder the laughter, the longer the show. Laughter created hierarchy. It marked the difference between observer and observed. The laughing citizen felt whole, at least for a moment. The object of the laugh was isolated, reduced, often voiceless. In this hierarchy, pain became entertainment, and fear, especially of one's own bodily decline, was temporarily displaced onto someone else. The Roman graffiti that survives bears traces of this. On walls in Pompeii, we find crude sketches of misshapen bodies, exaggerated genitals, mocked faces, slurs carved into plaster, private humor made permanently public. Even the tombs of jesters and entertainers sometimes note the deformities that made them famous, as if the body itself had become the joke that outlived the man. But not all who were mocked remained passive. Some performers, particularly those who were clever with words, reclaimed the sting. A dwarf with a sharp tongue, a blind man with perfect memory, a crippled poet whose verses bit deeper than the jokes made at his expense. These were rare stories, but real ones. Resistance in Rome was often quiet, worn into the lines of a face that kept performing long after the crowd had gone home. And still, even in the laughter, there was unease, because every Roman knew that the body could change, that health was a brief condition, that a cough, a slip, a fever could transform a man from senator to shadow. And in that awareness, laughter became more desperate, more aggressive. It was not just about mocking others, it was about holding despair at bay. If you laughed first, you were not the victim, not yet. Laughter, then, was both shield and weapon. It filled the baths, the forums, the taverns, the family dinners. But it also lingered long after the jokes had faded, clinging to the walls, to the memory of the ones laughed at and forgotten. Because in Rome, as in all empires, Cruelty often wears the mask of humor. And behind that mask, there is always someone left silent. In ancient Rome, privacy was not a right. It was a luxury, and even then, one that often proved illusory. Walls were thin, windows faced windows, courtyards echoed with footsteps and whispers. Your movements, your rituals, your mistakes, these were not hidden. They were seen, discussed, remembered. In this crowded empire of stone and smoke, your life was not your own. It belonged in part to those who watched. The Roman home was porous, not in the literal sense, but in the way its boundaries failed to protect. Tenement walls were little more than plaster and wood, letting sound travel like water through cracks. A cough at midnight, a muffled argument, a prayer whispered too loudly. The ears of neighbors were always near. The silence of solitude was rare, if not impossible. And what they heard, they judged. Morality in Rome was not simply a private matter, it was a public expectation. A man's reputation was his wealth, and a woman's modesty was her shield. Deviate from expectation, wear too much color, entertain a visitor too late, laugh too loudly in the wrong company, and you invited scrutiny, not only from magistrates, but from the market seller, the washerwoman, the child in the stairwell. The gaze of Rome was diffuse. It came from everywhere at once. It was not only the powerful who watched, the poor did too. In the crowded neighborhoods of Subura and Trastevere, gossip was as valuable as bread. A neighbor's downfall could be a distraction from your own suffering. A whispered story could shift suspicion, soften envy, or justify cruelty. Did you hear what she did? They say his wife visits another man. He drinks more than he prays. These phrases floated from window to window, like laundry hanging in the breeze. There were no social networks, no surveillance cameras. But reputations traveled faster than light. A single accusation could freeze a household. A careless comment could unravel a marriage. The courts might never intervene, but the neighborhood would. The Roman concept of existimatio, reputation, was foundational. Without it, contracts were harder to secure. Friendships waned, marriage prospects crumbled. Even burial rights could be denied. And reputation was not self-defined. It was decided collectively by those who saw you eat, bathe, walk, and age. It was shaped by how you were spoken of when you were not in the room. Women bore the sharpest weight of this gaze. Their movements were noted with particular vigilance. A respectable woman was not only chaste, but visibly so. Her clothing, her pace, her posture. All were read as signs. A glance held too long, a garment worn too loose. These were not simply choices. They were statements, open to interpretation, and once interpreted, they could not be unsaid. Widows were watched to ensure they mourned long enough. Brides were watched to ensure they obeyed quickly enough. Mothers were watched to see if their children reflected virtue or shame. Silence was safer than speech, stillness safer than dance. Even in worship, eyes followed. Temples were open spaces, and public rituals required attendance, but lingered too long or appeared too fervent, and questions arose. Was it sincere, or was it show? Was she pious, or hiding something beneath that veil? The line between sacred and suspicious was drawn not by the divine, but by those who watched from the shadows. Men, too, were judged, though often by different measures. A man's honor rested on control of his household, his temper, his appetites. To be too indulgent was dangerous. To be too passive, suspect. Was he a cuckold, a drunk, a fool? Did his slaves obey him or mock him behind his back? These questions shaped not only his social standing, but his legacy. Even the dead were not safe from slander. And if someone wished to harm you, they did not need a knife. A rumor could wound more deeply. A story, carefully timed, could erase years of respectability. It did not have to be true. It only had to be repeated. To live in Rome was to perform. Each day, you stepped onto a stage without curtains, without exit. Your clothing, your gestures, your silences, all scrutinized. And in this constant surveillance, people learned to mask, to mimic, to hide in plain sight. But the strain left traces, in lowered gazes, in hands that hesitated before waving, in friendships guarded by obligation rather than affection, in the way people whispered blessings only after the door had closed. The Romans built an empire of roads, aqueducts, temples, and laws, but they also built invisible walls made of expectation, of gossip, of eyes that never blinked. And within those walls, even in the heart of one's own home, solitude was a dangerous illusion, because someone somewhere was always listening, and silence too could be interpreted. Beneath the grandeur of Rome's marble forums, behind the carved busts and golden laurels, beneath even the skin of its people, were scars meant not for healing, but for remembering. These were not the honorable scars of battle or the weathered lines of age. They were marks of submission, of possession, of punishment. In ancient Rome, ink could silence a name, burn could overwrite a life. To understand the Roman tattoo is not to imagine art. There were no intricate dragons or floral patterns. No declarations of love or freedom etched in cursive. The marks made on Roman bodies were tools of control, functional, brutal, permanent. Slaves, especially those who attempted escape or were deemed dangerous, were often tattooed by force. These tattoos were not hidden. They were placed deliberately on the forehead, the arms, the neck, places the eye could not miss. The messages were cruelly simple. I belong to Marcus. Stop me. I am a fugitive. Tax slave. Property of the treasury. Each word was a sentence. Each letter, a brand. The ink used was often made from ash or soot, mixed with oil or vinegar. Applied with sharp needles, driven into the flesh by hand, the process was painful, slow, and administered with indifference. No comfort was given, no rest permitted. The intention was not just to mark the body, but to unmake the person. And for many, it worked. A tattooed slave could not pass for free, could not forget, could not be forgotten. The mark became a second face, one worn even while sleeping. Strangers would read it before they heard a voice. Employers would see it before hearing a plea. Lovers, if they came at all, would pause over those blackened letters and understand what they meant. This body, this history, was owned. Even freed slaves bore marks that could not be erased. Though legally liberated, some still carried the tattoos of their past, visible reminders of bondage. For them, freedom was not clean. It was stained, a bitter gift wrapped in memory and judgment. Criminals, too, were marked. Those sentenced to the mines, to gladiatorial schools, to penal labor, were often branded with fire or ink. The message might be a symbol, a single word, or a phrase that reduced the man to his offense. Thief, murderer, deserter. Some bore the abbreviation FVG, fugitivus. Others had lines etched into their foreheads like invisible cages, ensuring that wherever they went, their shame arrived first. And for the Romans who saw these marks, the message was clear. This body does not belong to itself. It is named by another. It is defined not by its heart or its hands, but by its owner or its crime. But there were other uses too. Some religious cults, especially in the later empire, adopted the practice of tattooing as a sign of devotion, a cross, a sacred name, a symbol etched not in shame but in pride. Yet even here, the practice carried risk. Under emperors hostile to their faith, such marks became targets. Proof of allegiance was also proof of defiance. Tattoos became confessions written in flesh, impossible to retract. And in battle, soldiers sometimes bore marks of their unit or emperor. These were not official and not always welcomed, but they existed, a quiet signal of loyalty or perhaps of belonging in a world that often stripped men of both. Still, for most who bore them, Roman tattoos were not chosen. They were inflicted. The body, once marked, was never again just skin and bone. It became a message board, a map of control, a warning to others, a resignation for the self. And removal was rare. Some tried, burning the ink out with hot irons, cutting the flesh, covering old words with new scars. But the skin remembered. The message faded, but never fully vanished. The pain did not cleanse. It only added another layer. Rome was an empire obsessed with names, with records, with status. And tattoos were a part of that obsession, a way to fix identity in place, to prevent escape, to make sure no one forgot who was owned, who had failed, who was less than whole. There is no marble for these lives, no statues carved in their honor, only ink, faded, buried, silent, and the skin that bore it, long turned to dust. The Roman theater was never just theater. It was hunger disguised as culture. It was pain cloaked in poetry. It was ritual, judgment, pleasure, punishment, all folded into one public breath. The amphitheater, with its rows of stone seats carved into the earth, did not merely entertain. It reminded the crowd of power, of bodies that could be shaped, used, broken, sometimes for art, and sometimes just because it pleased the watching eye. Theaters in ancient Rome were spaces of extremes. The most refined rhetoric could unfold on stage, elegant Latin phrases about loyalty, betrayal, and honor, only to be interrupted by laughter, shouting, or worse, blood. Because while most actors performed illusions, some performances required reality, and in Rome, that often meant death. Actors were considered lowly, their craft both valued and reviled. They could stir a crowd to tears, but they were denied political rights. Their bodies were praised on stage, but they were often treated with disdain, and yet they played essential roles in civic and religious life. Some performed tragedies with masks of wax and linen, others pantomimed myths accompanied by flutes and lyres. But beneath the structure of performance was a fragile boundary, one that, in certain cases, the state or the audience demanded be crossed. There were plays, public spectacles, where condemned prisoners were not merely made to act. They were made to die. Sometimes it was done in the name of realism. If a scene called for a beheading, a real one would occur. If the myth described a character burned alive or torn apart by beasts, then a criminal dressed in costume would suffer that fate in front of a cheering audience. The myth of Orpheus being dismembered by wild animals became more than poetry. It became a sentence carried out, with a man forced to play the role until the animals no longer left a role to play. This was called fatal charades, a form of capital punishment masked as drama. The condemned, often already stripped of legal personhood, became characters in their final moments. They did not die anonymously in dungeons. They died before the public, dressed as legends, their screams woven into the narrative. But this blend of theater and execution was not only for criminals. Gladiators, too, performed mythological scenes when not battling. Their performances sometimes ended in death, staged and real blurring until they became the same. The crowd, educated in myth and eager for blood, understood every reference. When a man mimicked the fall of Hector or the sacrifice of a virgin priestess, they knew both the story and the outcome. Applause followed, loud and raucous, not for the courage of the actor, but for the seamlessness of the illusion, for the thrill of seeing a story made flesh. Rome celebrated that kind of transformation, the turning of myth into meat. And yet not all theater was fatal. Many actors lived long, exhausting lives. They performed for coins, traveling from city to city, playing for senators or the poorest villagers. Their bodies carried the marks of their craft, strained voices, worn joints, broken toes from endless rehearsals on uneven ground. They memorized hundreds of lines, navigated complex plots, and kept their masks in perfect balance. But they also knew one misstep in the wrong performance, one unlucky choice, and the stage could become their grave. Even in non-lethal plays, the theater was never a safe space. It was raw with politics, rivalry, and risk. Satirical pieces poked at emperors, mocked senators, and disguised dissent in verse. And though satire was a Roman tradition, the line between humor and treason was perilously thin. An actor might speak a line that thrilled the crowd but chilled a magistrate. Retribution came later, quiet, deliberate, final. For women, the stage was an even more dangerous place. Few were permitted to act. Those who did often performed in private venues or on the fringes of accepted society. Some became famous, desired, admired, but fame was brittle, and admiration was often laced with contempt. A woman who displayed her body on stage, no matter how artfully, was considered morally suspect. The theater allowed visibility, but not dignity, and still the crowds came. They packed the seats, sweating under the open sun, or pressed shoulder to shoulder in torch-lit halls. They laughed, they cried, they shouted. They watched as bodies moved, danced, screamed, died. They watched because the theater offered something Rome prized more than anything: control over the uncontrollable, the illusion that even death could be scripted, even suffering could have rhythm. The stage was a mirror, and in it, Rome saw itself, brilliant, violent, poetic, cruel. And the actors? They were reflections that sometimes cracked, sometimes bled, and sometimes never rose again. In the shadows of Rome's marble columns and golden temples, where statues of gods watched with silent indifference, power did not move only through armies or edicts. It passed just as often through bedrooms, through whispers carried on silk sheets, through bruised thighs and calculated glances. Sex in ancient Rome was not confined to privacy. It was deeply political, a force that could elevate or destroy, that could bind enemies or expose secrets. Reputation was Rome's true currency, and nothing threatened reputation more than scandal. Accusations of sexual misconduct, whether real or fabricated, could bring down senators, generals, even emperors. A whispered affair, a suggestive letter, a servant's rumor. These were not just gossip, they were weapons. Political rivals often use sex to discredit each other. If a man was said to be too passive, too indulgent, too enamored with a slave or prostitute, he was painted as weak, as unfit to rule. If a woman was accused of infidelity, especially a woman of influence, she could be banished, her property seized, her name erased from family records. The Senate might not have needed proof. The suspicion alone could suffice. And behind the curtains, the games were more complex still. Elite Roman women were rarely free, but they were not always powerless. A well-placed affair could buy protection. A discreet lover in the imperial court could provide access to information, to favors, to silence. Courtesans and high-end prostitutes, trained in rhetoric and music, often found themselves in the middle of diplomatic intrigues. Their presence at feasts and private villas was not incidental. They listened, they remembered, and sometimes they spoke when it served their survival. Prostitution itself, while widespread and largely legal, was deeply stratified. At the bottom, brothels offered flesh like fruit, exposed named by number or nickname without choice. But at the top, elite prostitutes, some slaves, some freed women, operated with strategy. Their clients were powerful, their alliances delicate. Some were paid not merely for their bodies, but for their silence, for their ability to be present and invisible at once. The state, for its part, regulated prostitution with quiet hypocrisy. On one hand, brothels were taxed. Prostitutes were required to register. On the other, their existence was seen as a necessary evil, a release valve for male desire, a protection against worse disorders. But while men could visit brothels freely, women caught in sexual scandal faced far worse. The double standard was brutal. A man's affairs might be shrugged off. A woman's, especially a noble woman's, could spell ruin. The imperial court was especially dangerous. There, sex was surveillance. The beds of emperors became maps of influence. To be loved by a ruler was to be envied, targeted, watched. And when that love faded, what remained was exposure. Many mistresses were accused of poisoning, of treason, of witchcraft, not because of their crimes, but because of their closeness to power. Even within marriages, the political nature of sex was clear. Marriages were arranged for alliances, not affection. A woman's fidelity was tied to legitimacy, her body a container for lineage, her chastity a guarantee of inheritance. A man, however, was judged more by control than faithfulness. His wife's behavior reflected his honor, her deviation, his failure. There are countless stories told in half-truths and fragments of how sex reshaped Roman politics, of a general brought down by a jealous lover, of a senator's son seduced and blackmailed, of a noble woman who used seduction to infiltrate enemy circles, only to be exposed, flogged, exiled, of a freed woman who became the silent confidant of 3 emperors, not because she seduced them, but because she understood how others did. And beyond the elite, ordinary people too lived these tensions. A slave punished for perceived flirtation, a widow accused of promiscuity for remarrying too quickly, a man mocked in the baths for playing the woman. Sexuality in Rome was not identity. It was currency, it was danger, it was display. It is tempting to look back and see freedom where there was only exposure, to romanticize the wildness, the sensuality. But underneath the performances, the whispers, the rituals, lay something sharper, fear of being seen, of being caught, of being used. Rome wrapped its power in togas and metaphors, in armor and marble, but often it was undressed, in silence, in pleasure, in betrayal. And the empire shifted, not with swords, but with secrets spoken in the dark. In a city that never seemed to sleep, where the clang of metal echoed through the streets and markets swelled with life, from dawn until dusk, there were those for whom time had begun to slow, for whom footsteps grew hesitant, memory faded like worn frescoes, and voices, once respected, became whispers barely heard. In the heart of the Roman Empire, old age was not always honored. It was often endured in silence. There were no homes for the elderly in ancient Rome, no institutions of care, no sanctuaries designed to cradle the final chapters of life. The Roman family, in theory, was the primary support for its aging members. The pater familias, the male head of household, was supposed to command respect throughout his lifetime, and yet, when strength left his limbs and clarity left his mind, that respect often waned. Younger relatives vied for inheritance, for control. Their eyes turned elsewhere. For aging women, the experience was even more fragile. Their value, once tied to fertility, to household management, to the bearing of sons, faded with the body's changes. Widows, if fortunate, retained a portion of their husband's estate. but many lived precariously, dependent on the goodwill of sons, sons' wives, or distant relations. A woman who had once ruled a household might find herself eating in silence, ignored in the corner of a room she used to command. And when the family failed, isolation followed. Old men sat on stoops watching life pass by, uninvited, unneeded. Old women wandered temple steps clutching charms, whispering prayers for ailments no physician would treat. Some found solace in religion, in rituals repeated like lullabies. Others simply disappeared into alleys, into shadows, into silence. There was no pension, no safety net. Laborers who had spent their youth hauling bricks, tanning hides, forging iron, found that their usefulness expired long before their breath. Without family, an aging laborer could be reduced to begging. A former soldier might end up sleeping beneath a public portico, once praised, now pitied, or worse, ignored. The Roman census occasionally noted the presence of elderly dependents, but these were numbers, not names, a footnote in the annals of empire. No marble monument was raised for a grandmother who died tending to her grandchild. No scroll remembered the shoemaker who could no longer stitch straight. There are letters, scattered, rare, in which Roman citizens wrote of their aging parents. Some reveal tenderness, sons sending money from afar, daughters begging for better treatment, but others hint at burden, complaints about illness, about confusion, about mouths that no longer had stories, only complaints. The Stoic philosophers spoke of death as a natural end, to be met with dignity. But dignity is a luxury when the body is in pain, and the room is cold, and no one answers when you call. Seneca, himself old, wrote of the need for serenity in decline, but even he knew not everyone dies surrounded by calm, some die waiting. And yet, even in neglect, there were rituals. The dead were washed, anointed, veiled. If family remained, coins were placed over the eyes, offerings made to the household gods. But if no one came, if the old man died alone, or the old woman collapsed in the street, the body might be taken by municipal slaves, buried in a pauper's grave without name or marker. A life returned to earth with no witness. Rome celebrated youth, strength, lineage. Its statues were carved in the image of the ideal form, firm, upright, unwrinkled. But the truth of life unfolded differently. Backs curved, hands trembled, eyes dimmed. The empire's heartbeat, so often celebrated in triumph and conquest, also faltered quietly in the chests of the forgotten. Old age in Rome was not always misery. Some families loved deeply, some elders lived surrounded by laughter and warmth. But the system offered little for those left behind by time. There was no structure, no guarantee, just the hope that someone would still listen, that someone would still see. It is late, perhaps after the last oil lamps have been dimmed, and the warm terracotta of a Roman domus holds the memory of the day's heat. Somewhere behind a woven curtain, a child dreams. Somewhere else, a widow folds a worn tunic, thinking of someone who no longer walks through the doorway. In Rome, death was not hidden. It was not exiled to cemeteries or whispered about only in mourning. It was everywhere, a quiet, constant presence, a part of the furniture, a part of the wall, a part of the breath of life itself. To walk into a Roman home was to walk into a world that did not turn away from finitude. Death was part of the decor, not only in the literal sense of art and symbol, but in the textures of daily thought, in the layout of rooms, in the stories told over dinner, in the choices of fragrance, food, and even architecture. Mosaics, those delicate tapestries of stone and color, did not always depict beauty or abundance. Some of the most intricate showed skulls, carefully balanced on the scale of justice, reminding both slave and senator that beneath their clothing, beneath their power or poverty, all bodies ended the same. These images were not relegated to somber corners. They adorned atriums, tricliniums, the very spaces where guests reclined and laughed and drank sweet wine. Memento mori, remember that you must die, was not a reprimand. It was a companion. Above a feast, one might see painted skeletons with goblets in their bony fingers, reclining as guests themselves, suggesting that the joy of life was sharpened only by the awareness of its end. Life is short, one inscription said. While you live, be merry. But the message was not hedonistic. It was not indulgence without thought. It was presence, the kind of presence that only awareness of mortality makes possible. Romans believed that to forget death was to live foolishly. To pretend that time would not come for you was not brave. It was blind. So they built reminders into everything. Even their gardens might feature statues of sleeping children or aging philosophers, their faces serene, their features softened by weather and lichen, silently reminding those who walked among them that all bloom fades, that even stone wears down. And yet, it was not all solemnity. There was humor in these reflections, a sense that death, while certain, need not always be feared. The poet Marshall often joked about the futility of wealth after death. "What use is a golden tomb?" he asked. "The worms are not impressed." These verses were not nihilistic. They were grounding. They cut through illusion, through ambition, through anxiety. Inside many Roman homes, especially those of the affluent, death was honored through the presence of ancestral masks, imagines, cast from the faces of the dead in wax. These were not hidden in closets or left to rot in silence. They were kept in wooden cabinets and displayed during festivals and funerals. When a Roman noble died, actors, hired or chosen from family, would wear these masks in a grand procession, walking the streets as living echoes of those who came before. The dead walked with the living. The past breathed alongside the present. This ritual, though reserved for elites, spoke to a larger truth. Death was not an interruption. It was a continuation, a thread that ran through generations. Not something to be escaped, but something to be understood, to be folded into life's design, like shadow into light. Even the structure of Roman houses reflected this. Many homes had a room called the Narration, a small shrine dedicated to household gods and spirits of the dead. Here, daily offerings were made, a bit of bread, a few drops of wine, a whisper of gratitude. The presence of the dead was not mourned endlessly, it was acknowledged, nourished, included. And beyond the private sphere, the city itself wore its dead on its sleeves. Roman roads were lined with tombs, not hidden behind gates, but placed openly so that every traveler, rich or poor, hurried or weary, would pass by them. These tombs were not anonymous. They bore names, professions, sometimes even sculpted scenes of the deceased at work. A baker at his oven, a teacher with his pupils, a midwife holding an infant. These were not grand achievements. They were ordinary moments, remembered because they mattered. And then there were the epitaphs. Carved into stone, they spoke in voices both proud and tired. Some pleaded, "Do not disturb my bones." Others advised, "Eat, drink, love, for you do not know how long the gods will be kind." Many offered simple facts, name, age, trade, cause of death. But even these brief inscriptions carried weight. They preserved a person's presence in the world, even after that presence had dissolved into ash or earth. The home of the dead in Rome was never far from the home of the living. A young bride might sleep in a room where her grandmother's ashes rested nearby. A soldier returning from campaign might pass the tomb of a childhood friend. Death was not abstract. It was named. It had a face. And because of that, it lost some of its terror. Even domestic objects whispered of mortality, oil lamps shaped like skulls, cups etched with skeletons dancing, rings engraved with Latin warnings about time's cruelty. These were not accessories of despair. They were quiet teachers, carried in pockets, worn on fingers, lit every night. And what of the children? Did they not fear? Perhaps. But they too were raised with the truth of it. Stories told by the hearth included ghosts, yes, but also ancestors watching over. They learned to light incense not to banish death, but to honor it, to make room for it at the table. To speak softly when mentioning the dead not out of fear, but out of reverence. Rome, for all its cruelty, for all its grandeur, knew this, that death did not wait in the distance. It lived among the vases, the bricks, the paintings. It peered out from eyes carved in stone, and when it came it found no locked door, only an open one, with a room prepared, a place at the table, and a life, however brief, already woven into the tapestry of the eternal city. In the heart of the Roman Empire, not all wounds were visible. Not every punishment broke the skin. Some seeped beneath it, into the spirit, into the sense of self, cutting deeper than any lash. The Romans, great engineers of roads and aqueducts, were also architects of silence, of shame, of the kind of control that marked not the body, but the soul. While much of what we remember of Roman justice involves whips, chains, crucifixions, or arenas soaked in blood, there was another kind of punishment, quieter, colder, and perhaps more enduring. These were the punishments that left no scar, punishments designed not to hurt, but to humiliate, not to destroy the body, but to make it tremble, inwardly, for years to come. One of the most subtle and powerful forms was social isolation. The Roman concept of infamia, infamy, was not just a stain on one's record, it was a slow exile from dignity itself. To be declared infamous meant to lose the right to testify in court, to wear the toga of a citizen, to be greeted by name in the forum. You were not struck. You were not imprisoned. You were simply ignored. People turned their heads when you passed. Conversations halted as you entered. Your presence became a discomfort, your absence a relief. For a society so rooted in reputation, invisibility, in the power of the spoken word, this kind of punishment was devastating. It rendered a person invisible while they were still breathing. Then there were the rituals of public shame. Why, a man caught in moral or civic failure might be made to stand before a crowd in rags, sometimes with a placard around his neck describing his crime. There were no lashes, no blood, just the weight of hundreds of eyes, staring, judging. Turning your mistake into a spectacle. Women especially were subject to these forms of symbolic punishment. A wife suspected of adultery could be marched through the streets without her veil, her hair undone, both acts that exposed her to the world in a way that violated the Roman sense of feminine dignity. She might not be touched, but her body would burn with a fire lit by gazes, whispers, and the unspoken sentence, "You are no longer worthy of privacy." Tituri. There were also exclusions from religious life, an often overlooked but spiritually piercing form of penalty. In a society where the favor of the gods was woven into every meal, every birth, every political act, being banned from sacrifice or temple entry was a kind of severance. You no longer belonged to the divine rhythm. Your prayers had no audience. Your offerings were refused. It was a cosmic silence, one that could feel colder than iron. Among the elite, exile was another form of scarless punishment. To be banished from Rome was to be untethered, not only from friends or family, but from identity itself. The city was the sun around which life revolved. Its forums, its temples, its libraries were more than places. They were stages where one's life acquired meaning. To be removed was not only to be relocated, it was to be erased. Some were forced to live in rural isolation, where news traveled slowly and companionship came with the silence of nature. Others were confined to distant islands, beautiful perhaps, but heavy with emptiness. Here, the punishment was not delivered by a whip. It was delivered by wind, by memory, by the echo of your own name unanswered. And within households, especially among slaves, punishment often came not in beatings, but in rituals of humiliation. A slave might be made to serve naked, not for erotic display, but to erase dignity, to eat on the floor, to speak only when spoken to be laughed at, mocked in front of guests, to be treated in every gesture as a thing. These practices required no blood, no bruises, only repetition, only the quiet reinforcement that one's place was beneath, outside, forgotten. Even the army, so often remembered for discipline by blade, employed silent punishments. A soldier might be denied rations or made to sleep outside the tent, his armor removed, his rank stripped. Not a blow, but a taking away. Not pain, but absence. He would watch his comrades eat, watch their fire burn, and feel his own warmth fade. There is also the unspoken realm of familial erasure. A son who defied his father could be disinherited. A daughter who married poorly might be left unnamed in the family tomb. To be removed from lineage was to be sentenced to historical death. No one would call your name during ancestral rites. No one would pour wine on your grave. Your blood might still run through your descendants, but your memory would not. Rome, for all its fascination with violence, understood something far deeper, that some wounds do not bleed, that silence can be sharper than steel, that to be made invisible, to be made into nothing without a mark, is a form of cruelty that lingers longer than pain. And so, amid the clamor of swords and crowds, there was also the hush of shame, the silence of rooms from which someone had been expelled, the emptiness of a name no longer spoken, the punishment that left no scar, but never truly healed. The Roman child, so often imagined today as a figure of innocence, play, and boundless joy, lived in a world that whispered early of loss, discipline, and duty. Childhood in the Roman Empire was not a sanctuary from the hardships of life. It was its rehearsal. From the very first breath, a Roman child was not merely raised. They were trained, conditioned, molded for endurance, and always, whether softly or violently, prepared for pain. Infancy began not with celebration, but with decision. A newborn was placed at the feet of the father. If he picked up the child, it was accepted into the family. If he turned away, it might be abandoned, left outside the house, at the edge of a street, or beside a temple. The reasons could be many: poverty, deformity, illegitimacy, misfortune. But for the infant, the lesson began before memory took root. Love was not guaranteed. Those who survived learned quickly that affection came second to structure. Roman children, especially among the freeborn, were subject to tight expectations. Boys were taught to be strong, stoic, relentless. Girls to be obedient, modest, silent. Emotions were tolerated only in small, manageable doses. Crying too much might earn mockery. Curiosity could be met with coldness. The ideal Roman child was not playful. They were controlled. Even games, those flashes of joy that children across cultures instinctively seek, were laced with lessons in pain. There were toy swords, yes, but also miniature whips. Small chariots and gladiatorial dolls mimicked the violence of adult entertainment. Boys engaged in wrestling not just for sport, but as training for future battles, social, political, or literal. They learned to fall, to strike, to get up again without tears, and punishment was never far. Corporal punishment was common. Teachers carried rods. Fathers, legal masters of the household, could strike children as they saw fit. A mispronounced word, a broken object, a poorly recited verse could earn a blow. Girls, too, were disciplined, though often more through restriction than force. A door locked, a voice silenced, a freedom revoked. Beyond the physical, there was emotional training, often more insidious. A child might be told not to laugh too freely lest they appear foolish, not to speak without permission, not to question authority. Boys were mocked for being too gentle. Girls were praised not for brilliance, but for stillness. In every gesture, children learned that their bodies, their instincts, their voices were not fully theirs, and they were surrounded by the realities of death. Siblings died young. Friends vanished without explanation. One fever, one wound, one unlucky cough, and a child's playmate might be gone. Some children wore protective amulets, tiny charms against the evil eye or illness. But charms could not stop the plagues, the malnutrition, the dangers of the street. Children visited graves, participated in funerals. They saw their elders pour wine onto the tombs of ancestors. They heard the keening of mourning women. They were not shielded from loss. They were instructed in how to carry it. Girls especially were taught that their bodies were not private. By adolescence, a girl might already be engaged, promised to a man decades older. Her future was not hers to imagine. It was chosen, shaped, negotiated. Her chastity was watched, her steps counted, her words measured. In some households, she wore a belt that symbolized her virginity, locked and overseen until her wedding night. Boys, too, faced early burdens. At age 14, a boy assumed the toga of manhood. He was now expected to speak in court, to prepare for military service, to manage property. The moment was marked not with play, but with pressure. Childhood was over, if it had ever truly begun. Slaves' children faced even harsher realities. Born into servitude, their lives were work from the start. They might carry messages, tend animals, serve in kitchens before they could even spell their names. Their childhood was not a stage of life. It was a tool of labor. They were punished as adults, traded as goods, and often forgotten in death. And yet, within these constraints, flickers of humanity persisted. A mother braiding her daughter's hair, a father teaching his son to swim, a carved toy found buried beside a child's bones, perhaps a favorite, perhaps clutched at the moment of death. These moments remind us that even in systems designed to control, love still surfaced, not always enough to protect, but enough to linger. The Roman child was not raised to dream. They were raised to endure, to stand straight even when trembling, to speak clearly even when terrified, to bear the future, no matter how heavy. And so the trauma did not begin in adulthood. It was not a sudden blow. It was a whisper, heard early and often. You must be strong. You must be silent. You must be ready. In a civilization where lineage was sacred and the family line a mirror of both private virtue and public duty, the womb held immense symbolic weight. In Rome, to bear children was not merely a personal choice, it was a civic expectation, a religious calling, a legacy bound to the health of the state itself. And so, infertility did not sit quietly in the background. It festered, it frightened. It shaped lives in ways that reached far beyond the body. For Roman women, the pressure was relentless. A wife was expected to give birth as early and as often as possible. The birth of a child, especially a son, secured her place in the household. Without it, her presence was often tolerated but not honored. A woman who failed to conceive might be whispered about at market stalls, pitied in bathhouses, avoided at rituals that celebrated fertility. She might be offered herbs, prayers, or warnings, and if the years passed without children, she risked being cast aside. The laws themselves reflected this cultural weight. Under Augustus, marriage laws encouraged reproduction by rewarding those with children and punishing those without. Bachelors faced fines. Childless couples lost privileges. The Roman state did not separate intimacy from legislation. It saw in every empty cradle a threat to continuity. And so the infertile woman often found herself caught between superstition and shame. There were rituals, dozens of them, some drawn from ancient tradition. Others whispered from one midwife to another. Women wore amulets inscribed with protective spells. They bathed in spring waters deemed sacred to fertility goddesses. They slept with dolls of Isis, or knelt before shrines to Juno Lucina, patroness of childbirth. They walked barefoot under moonlight, mixed honey with herbs, pressed warm stones against their bellies. Some drank infusions of exotic roots, others accepted more disturbing prescriptions, the ashes of stillborn animals. The blood of gladiators, the bile of sacrificed birds, anything to tilt the balance, anything to escape the silence of an unfilled cradle. And always in the shadows, there was blame. Rarely did the man shoulder it. The Roman view of masculinity tied virility to strength, to political power, to divine favor. A man who failed to father children might be mocked in private, but it was the woman who bore the public suspicion. Barren became a label, not just of biology, but of failure. A failure of body, a failure of purpose. Even the household structure reinforced the pressure. Servants tracked menstrual cycles. Midwives inspected bodily fluids. Mothers-in-law offered unsolicited advice, often sharp. A woman's body became a monitored space, a site of expectation, her hunger, her rest, her dreams. All could be interpreted through the lens of fertility. Did she eat too little? Was she too anxious? Did she offend a goddess? Each month became a reckoning. Each delay, a source of panic. And yet, despite the silence, the fear, the weight of expectation, women still formed quiet solidarities. In the corners of temples, in the moments between rituals, one might take another's hand, press a fig charm into her palm and say, "I waited too." These gestures, small, fleeting, formed a hidden network of resilience. For men, too, infertility had a shadow, though it was more hidden. A senator whose wife bore no children might worry about his heirs. A merchant might wonder if his lineage would vanish. Some turned to concubines, others to adoption. And in the rare cases where a man admitted his own impotence, the confession often came wrapped in metaphor. "The gods closed my gate," or "my fields yield no grain." And then there were those who never married, who lived without children in a world that saw such a life as incomplete, some by choice, others by pain. Their homes were quieter, their names carried no promise of continuation. But their lives still unfolded, full of stories, full of small joys and unspoken griefs. Infertility in Rome was not a medical condition, it was a social echo. It was the ache of absence at family festivals. It was the glance of a neighbor, the silence after a prayer, the drawer of unused baby linens, and it was also resilience. It was the woman who found strength beyond expectation, the man who left his fortune to a freed slave, the couple who, despite all, chose each other. In a city that carved its gods from marble, that built monuments to virility and abundance, there were still spaces for the unseen, for the yearning that had no name, for the dreams that did not take root, but still mattered. The Roman Empire, vast and seemingly invincible, pulsed with the lifeblood of millions, soldiers marching from border to border, traders crossing seas, slaves hauled through marketplaces, and citizens gathering in forums and baths. But with movement came exposure. With breath came risk, and when illness crept in, it did not knock. It entered, quietly, swiftly, dismantling certainty with every cough, every fever, every lifeless body left under the sun. Epidemics in Rome were not simply biological events, they were psychological earthquakes. The air itself could feel cursed. The streets, once alive with chatter, would grow still. People looked at each other differently, with suspicion, with sorrow, with the growing knowledge that anyone, everyone, was vulnerable. The Antonine Plague, arriving in the late 2nd century, is often considered one of the most devastating. It spread during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, whose own writings reflect a deep weariness, a sense that the very fabric of life was unraveling. Historians now believe it may have been smallpox, but the name didn't matter to those who suffered. To them, it was a fire that took breath and skin and future. Bodies piled in corners of insulae, Rome's apartment buildings. Temples overflowed with offerings. Physicians, armed with herbs and rituals, often fled or fell themselves. Entire villages emptied. In cities, carts creaked beneath the weight of the dead, their wheels groaning through streets still damp with wine and tears. And amid this collapse, fear became a kind of second illness. People stopped touching, stopped speaking. Some turned to the gods with renewed desperation. Others cursed them. The temples of Apollo and Aesculapius filled with incense and questions. Why? What sin had been committed? What rite had been forgotten? The old were especially vulnerable, and the poor, those who lived 10 to a room, those who drank from shared cisterns, and yet the rich were not safe either. Disease did not care for marble thresholds or embroidered tunics. It crept beneath doors, rested in fabrics, waited in the warmth of bodies. Later, the plague of Cyprian in the 3rd century struck again with merciless rhythm. Descriptions from the time are haunting: vomiting, blindness, throat swelling, death within days. Some called it divine punishment, others a sign of the end. The Bishop Cyprian wrote not only of the symptoms, but of the chaos: parents abandoning children, lovers fleeing from the touch of lovers, cities echoing with the cries of the deserted. And yet, not all ran, some stayed. In Christian communities, still small, still persecuted, care for the sick became an act of defiance, of grace. Men and women nursed the afflicted, even at risk to themselves. They held hands when no one else would. They whispered prayers to those whose names would be forgotten. Their mercy planted seeds of something new in the soil of collapse. But even for those who survived, the trauma remained. Epidemics carved wounds not only in lungs or limbs, but in memory. In the way people stepped back from each other, in how children learned that touch could be danger, in how a festival's music could turn ghostly overnight. Rome, with all its power, could not stop disease. It could only endure it. And even endurance had a price. Cemeteries filled. Inscriptions changed. Some tombs from this era speak plainly: taken too soon, one of many lost. The names of entire families disappear from public records. Silence followed them. And yet, the city went on. It staggered forward, thinner, wearier, but still breathing. The baths reopened. The forums echoed once more with voices. But beneath the laughter, there lingered a tremor, a memory of breath stolen too early, of bodies cooled too fast, of nights spent waiting for a fever to break and for dawn to arrive. The empire did not fall in one blow. It sickened, slowly, repeatedly. Its flesh weakened long before its walls cracked, and in that long, fevered decline, there was something achingly human. Not in the death tolls, or the rituals, or the fleeing, but in the hands that stayed, in the quiet mercy, in the choice to care even when death stood waiting at the door. Claro, a seguir apresentarei a conclusão, the human echo behind the Roman Colossus. Respeitando rigorosamente todas as orientações de tom, ritmo e estilo estabelecidas para um roteiro com duração de 240 minutos. Conclusão: The Human Echo Behind the Roman Colossus. As the last embers of our long journey through ancient Rome begin to fade, and the stone silhouettes of its once crowded streets dissolve into the stillness of memory, we are left not with statues or ruins, not with emperors or victories, but with the quiet, lingering presence of human breath, the kind that trembles, that aches, that endures. The Roman Empire at its peak was an intricate machine of glory and violence, of ceremony and cruelty. It dazzled with marble arches and silken robes, yet beneath those surfaces, just beneath, lay the aches of everyday people, a world of fatigue masked by ritual, of sorrow carried in silence, of lives too ordinary to be carved into stone, but no less real, no less worthy. And this was not the Rome of textbooks or triumphs. This was the Rome of whispering neighbors and aching backs, of women whose wombs were watched more closely than their dreams, of men punished with absence rather than chains, of children taught to smile through hunger and sit still through grief. It was the Rome where death slept at the hearth, where disease wrote its legacy in fading eyes, where silence could be a sentence and laughter sometimes a cruel mirror, where even the bath built for pleasure might become a place of collapse, of sickness, of invisible departure. What we have walked through tonight is not only history, it is sensation. It is the chill of a shadowed alleyway, the breathless pause before punishment, the warmth of a hand held in secret. It is the human within the imperial, the forgotten behind the celebrated. The ordinary souls whose stories were never written, but who felt everything just as deeply as you do now. Perhaps you are listening to this with tired eyes, wrapped in the hush of midnight. Perhaps you feel the same ache the Roman mother once did, counting losses rather than victories. Or the same restless heart of the craftsman, hoping his work might outlive his name. Or the same loneliness as the widow kneeling beside a crumbling lararium, whispering into silence. If so, know this: you are not alone. Because the empire, for all its strength, was filled with fragility. Because its colossus was built on bones that bent, on lives that broke, on hopes that flickered and flared like lamps in a storm. To remember them is not just to learn, it is to feel. It is to carry their breath forward, gently, quietly, into our own. So let us close this journey not with applause, not with conclusions, but with stillness, a moment to honor what remains unseen. A final glance back, through the dust and the arches, at a Rome not made of stone, but of longing, of fear, of small joys and deep weariness, the same things that make us human now, the same things that will echo long after the Colossus has fallen. Have a peaceful night. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the past, this gentle descent into the hidden layers of Roman life, I'd be grateful if you gave a quiet click on the like button and subscribed for more winding journeys through the captivating and complicated annals of history. As the final traces of this story fade into the hush of night, may your thoughts slow, your breath deepen, and your body find stillness. Perhaps now, in the dim light or the softness of your bed, you can feel it, that delicate tether between their world and ours, stretching gently through time. Let it soothe you, let it remind you that you are not alone. Until next time, sweet dreams.